Hello, my friend, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to travel far to the north, to a world of cold seas, dark forests, snow-covered mountains, long wooden houses, and enormous skies stretching over a landscape where the seasons could completely change the rhythm of life. A world we often imagine through one familiar picture: Viking warriors, longships, axes, swords, raids, battles, and fierce men sailing toward distant shores. But tonight, we're going to forget that image for a while, because there was another side to Viking life, a much quieter side. The Vikings celebrated, they gathered, they feasted, they drank, they told stories, they listened to poetry, they played games, they arranged marriages, they remembered the dead, they honored their gods, and sometimes they simply enjoyed having an excuse to eat something better than they normally could. For people living in Viking Age, Scandinavia, celebration was closely connected to the passing of the year. The seasons mattered a great deal. Summer meant longer days, more work in the fields, fishing, travel, trade, and preparation for the coming winter. Then, slowly, the days became shorter, the nights grew longer, the temperature dropped, the fields became quiet, and winter arrived. Today, we can turn on a light, increase the heating, walk into a supermarket, buy fresh food, and check the weather on a screen. The Vikings had none of these things. Their lives were much more closely connected to the natural world. If the harvest failed, people noticed. If winter arrived early, people noticed. If the sea became dangerous, people noticed. If spring finally returned after months of darkness, everyone noticed. And that is one reason festivals mattered so much. They gave people moments to stop, gather, and recognize the changing world around them. Imagine a Viking settlement during the darkest part of winter. Outside, the landscape is cold and silent. The sun disappears early. Snow may cover the ground. The animals are sheltered. Food has already been stored, and families are waiting for the days to become longer again. Inside a large wooden hall, everything feels different. There is a fire burning. People are talking. Food is being prepared. Visitors have arrived from neighbouring farms. Someone is pouring drink. Someone else is telling a story. And for a little while, the darkness outside doesn't matter quite so much. There is warmth. There is food. There is music. There is laughter. And there are other people. That gathering could be much more important than simply having a good evening. A festival could strengthen friendships, reinforce family relationships, create political alliances, allow merchants to trade, give chieftains an opportunity to demonstrate generosity, provide a place for religious ceremonies, and bring together people who might otherwise spend most of the year living separately. For a society without telephones, without newspapers, without social media, and without modern transportation, gatherings were incredibly valuable. A festival was a chance to hear what was happening beyond your own farm. Perhaps someone had returned from a distant journey. Perhaps a merchant had arrived with foreign goods. Perhaps there was news from another settlement. Perhaps someone had become engaged. Perhaps someone had died. Perhaps an old disagreement needed to be settled. And perhaps someone simply had an excellent story that everyone wanted to hear. The Viking world was also deeply connected to religion. People believed the supernatural world could influence their lives. The gods had names, stories, personalities, and relationships with humans. Odin, Thor, Freyja, Freyr, and many others. People hoped for good harvests, healthy animals, safe journeys, prosperity, peace, and protection. Festivals could therefore become religious occasions. Food might be offered. Drinks might be shared in ritual toasts. Animals could sometimes be sacrificed. And communities could gather to honour their gods and ancestors. But we should be careful. There was no single Viking festival celebrated in exactly the same way across Scandinavia. The Viking Age lasted for centuries. Scandinavia covered enormous distances. A farmer in Norway did not necessarily celebrate in precisely the same way as a family in Denmark. Local customs mattered. family traditions mattered, and religious practices changed over time. Much of what we know comes from archaeology, later written sources, and stories recorded after Christianity had already spread across Scandinavia. So there are mysteries. There are things historians can reconstruct with confidence, and things we simply cannot know for certain. Tonight, we'll keep those differences in mind. We're not going to turn the Viking world into a fantasy. We're going to follow the evidence and imagine what these celebrations may have felt like. We'll begin with the calendar itself. Why did the changing seasons matter so much? Then, we'll enter the dark winter world of Yule. We'll discover what might have appeared on a Viking feast table. We'll explore what they drank, why feasting was connected with status, and how religious rituals could become part of communal celebrations. We'll follow the return of spring. We'll experience the long Scandinavian days of summer. We'll reach the harvest, when food became especially precious. We'll attend weddings, and consider how Vikings remembered their dead. We'll sit beside the fire while poets and storytellers entertain a crowded hall. We'll watch children play. We'll discover what ordinary farmers experienced during these great gatherings, and we'll see how powerful chieftains could use generosity and celebration to strengthen their position. Then, we'll explore something even more interesting. What did Vikings actually believe about luck? Fate? The gods? And the mysterious forces they believed shaped their lives? Finally, we'll watch as Christianity slowly transforms the old Scandinavian calendar, changing some traditions, absorbing others, and eventually creating a new religious landscape. Because the festivals tell us something important. They show us what people valued, what they feared, what they hoped for, and what they wanted to share with one another. The Vikings were not celebrating because life was always easy. Quite the opposite. Life could be exhausting. Winter could be dangerous. Harvests could fail. Journeys could go wrong. Illness could arrive unexpectedly. And the sea could be unforgiving. Perhaps that made celebration even more meaningful. When food was available, you shared it. When the community gathered, you joined them. When winter passed, you welcomed the sun. When a wedding brought two families together, you feasted. When someone died, you remembered them. And when another year arrived, you hoped it would be a good one. So, tonight, we're leaving the battles behind. The longships can remain quietly on the distant sea. The warriors can put down their weapons. The shields can rest against the walls. And somewhere inside a warm Viking hall, the fire is already burning. People are beginning to arrive. Food is being carried inside. The doors open, and another guest steps through the darkness. Outside, the night is cold. Inside, the celebration is beginning. So make yourself comfortable. Lower the lights. Settle beneath your blankets. Take a slow breath, and let the modern world become quiet for a while. Tonight, we're going to spend an entire year with the Vikings. One season, one celebration, and one quiet gathering at a time. Because beyond the raids, beyond the battles, and beyond the famous Viking warriors, there was another world. A world of feasts, firelight, family, faith, music, stories, and celebration. And tonight, we're going to step quietly into that world. So, get comfortable, let your eyes grow heavy, and let's begin with why festivals mattered so much to the Vikings. Before we enter the great Viking festivals, before the fires are lit, before the food is carried into the halls, we need to understand something important. For the Vikings, the year itself was a kind of calendar written across the landscape. They didn't experience time exactly as we do. Today, we divide the year into neat little boxes. January, February, March. We look at a calendar on the wall, or a screen on our phone, and know precisely which day comes next. For a Viking farmer, the changing seasons were much more immediate. The weather told you what time of year it was. The fields told you. The animals told you. The length of daylight told you. And perhaps most importantly, your food supplies told you. Because in a farming society, the difference between a good year and a bad year could be enormous. A successful harvest meant full storage rooms, healthy animals, enough food for winter, and perhaps enough surplus to share during a great feast. A poor harvest meant something very different. less food, more uncertainty, and a much more difficult winter ahead. So when an important season arrived, people noticed, and they celebrated. Festivals were therefore not simply opportunities to have fun. They were connected to survival, religion, agriculture, family, politics, and community. Imagine living on a small farm in Scandinavia. Your house stands among fields and pasture. Nearby, there may be a few other farms. Beyond them, a forest, perhaps a river, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the sea. You work throughout much of the year. There is always something that needs doing. Animals need feeding. Fences need repairing. Wood needs cutting. Tools need maintaining. Food needs preparing. Fields need tending. And when winter approaches, everything has to be prepared. You can't simply decide to go shopping tomorrow. If you didn't store enough food, there might not be another source nearby, so the year follows a rhythm. Work, preparation, harvest, storage, winter, and then spring again. Festivals fit into this rhythm. They gave people moments when ordinary work could temporarily give way to gathering. And gathering was important, very important. Viking society depended heavily on relationships, family relationships, friendships, loyalty, trade, marriage, and political alliances. If you were a chieftain, you needed people to support you. You needed followers. You needed to demonstrate that you were capable of providing for them. And one of the best ways to demonstrate generosity was to host a great feast. Imagine walking into a powerful man's hall during a major celebration. The room is crowded. People have travelled from nearby settlements. Some are relatives. Some are friends. Some are important guests. Others are there because they owe the host loyalty. The fire is burning. Food is being served. Drink is being passed around. Everyone can see how much the host has provided. That mattered. A generous host could strengthen his reputation. A stingy one might not be remembered quite so fondly. We sometimes think of ancient feasts as simply enormous parties. But they could function almost like political events. People were watching. Who sat where? Who received the best food? Who was given gifts? Who was invited? Who wasn't invited? Who spoke? Who listened? Who arrived with the chieftain? Who left with him? These small details could reveal relationships. A feast could therefore be a place where social status became visible. But festivals weren't only for powerful people. Ordinary families participated too. And for them, the celebration could mean something much simpler. A break from routine. A chance to see relatives. A chance to hear stories. A chance to hear stories. A chance to meet people they hadn't seen for months. Remember, travel was difficult. There were no modern highways, no trains, no airplanes, no instant communication. If your relatives lived several settlements away, seeing them might require a serious journey. That made major gatherings valuable. A festival could bring many different people together in one place. And once everyone was gathered, other things could happen. Business could be conducted. Marriages could be discussed. Disputes could be settled. News could be exchanged. Promises could be made. And alliances could be strengthened. A festival was therefore part celebration, part social gathering, part religious occasion, and sometimes part political meeting. Religion was another reason these events mattered. The Vikings lived in a world filled with supernatural beliefs. The gods were part of their stories and traditions. Odin, Thor, Freya, and many other supernatural beings occupied different places in the religious imagination of Scandinavia. People wanted things from the gods: good harvests, healthy children, healthy animals, safe voyages, success in trade, victory when necessary, and peace when possible. Festivals could provide an opportunity to ask for these things, or to give thanks for them. That relationship between humans and the supernatural world was important. Imagine a farmer looking at his fields. His livelihood depends on weather, rain, sunshine, the right temperatures, and the absence of disasters. He can work incredibly hard, but he cannot control everything. That uncertainty creates a natural place for religion. A good harvest could feel like a blessing. A failed harvest could feel like something had gone terribly wrong. So communal rituals could become a way of dealing with that uncertainty. People gathered together. They performed traditions. They made offerings. They shared food. And they hoped for another successful year. The community itself was strengthened by the process. Everyone participated in the same event. Everyone heard the same stories. Everyone shared the same meal. And everyone became part of something larger than their individual household. That sense of belonging may have been one of the most important things festivals provided, because life could be physically demanding and sometimes lonely. A person living on a remote farm might spend much of the year surrounded by the same small group of people. Then, a major festival arrived. Suddenly, the world became bigger. More people, more voices, more stories, more food, more information, more opportunities, and probably more noise. A lot more noise, especially after several rounds of drinking. But even the noise had a purpose. It reminded people that they weren't alone. They belonged to a community. They had relatives, neighbours, friends, allies, and traditions that connected them to previous generations. This is another reason festivals can tell us so much about a society. What people celebrate reveals what they value. If a society celebrates harvests, food matters. If it celebrates marriages, family matters. If it honours ancestors, memory matters. If it gathers around religious rituals, faith matters. And if powerful leaders constantly host enormous feasts, generosity and status matter. The Viking festivals reflected all of these things. They were not random holidays scattered throughout the year. They were deeply connected to the way Viking society worked. And there was one particular celebration, one period of the year, when darkness, food, religion, family, and community all came together. Winter. The days were short. The nights were long. The harvest was already behind them, and everyone was waiting for the sun to slowly begin its return. This was the season of Yule. And for the Vikings, Yule could become one of the most important celebrations of the entire year. So, for now, let the fields become quiet. Let the last leaves disappear. Let the winter darkness settle over the Scandinavian landscape. And imagine a warm wooden hall, somewhere in the north, where preparations are already beginning. The fire is burning. Food is being gathered. Guests are arriving. And the longest nights of the year are about to become a little more bearable, because the Vikings were preparing to celebrate Yule. Now, let us stay in that quiet Scandinavian landscape for a little longer. The winter is approaching. The fields have been harvested. The animals are being brought closer to shelter. Firewood is being stacked. Food is being stored. And the days are becoming shorter. For the Vikings, the year was not simply a sequence of numbered months. It was a cycle, a rhythm, a pattern that returned again and again. Winter, spring, summer, autumn. And each part of that cycle brought different responsibilities, different dangers, different opportunities, and eventually, different reasons to celebrate. The Viking understanding of time was closely connected to the natural world. The sun mattered, the moon mattered, the weather mattered, and the agricultural year mattered. People needed to know when to plant, when to harvest, when animals would reproduce, when hay needed to be collected, when ships could travel more safely, and when winter preparations needed to begin. There were traditional names for periods of the year in the Old Norse world. The details could vary by region and period, but the basic idea was familiar. The year was divided according to seasonal changes, and unlike our modern calendar, these divisions were experienced physically. You could feel winter arriving, you could see spring returning, you could watch the fields change colour, and you could notice the days becoming longer. This was especially important in Scandinavia. Farther north, the difference between summer and winter daylight could be extraordinary. In winter, the sun might barely appear. In summer, the nights could become remarkably short. Imagine experiencing that without electric lights. During the darkest months, darkness wasn't simply something that happened after dinner. It could dominate everyday life. People gathered around fires. They worked by whatever light was available. They slept. They waited. And they hoped for the return of longer days. Then, slowly, the sun began to win. Each day became a little longer. The landscape began to change. Snow melted. Streams filled. Plants returned. Animals became active. And people began preparing for another season of work. Spring was therefore not simply beautiful. It was necessary. The agricultural year was beginning again. Fields needed to be prepared. Seeds needed to be planted. Animals needed attention. And the community had to prepare for the months ahead. A successful spring could lead to a successful year. A difficult spring could create problems that lasted for months. So seasonal celebrations were closely connected with these transitions. People weren't simply saying, "Spring has arrived." They were recognizing that an entirely different phase of life had begun. Then came summer. For many Viking communities, summer was the busiest season. The weather was more suitable for travel. The sea became more accessible. Ships could leave harbour. Trade could expand. Raiding expeditions could take place. And farmers had enormous amounts of work to complete. Fields needed tending. Hay needed gathering. Animals needed care. Food needed preparing. So although summer meant longer days, it did not necessarily mean more free time. Quite the opposite. The long daylight gave people more time to work, and that work was essential, because eventually autumn would arrive. The temperature would begin to fall. The fields would be harvested. Animals would be prepared for winter. Food would be stored. And people would begin thinking about the difficult months ahead. Harvest time could therefore be one of the most important periods of the entire year. The food collected during these weeks might determine how comfortable or how difficult the coming winter would be. A good harvest could mean celebration. A poor harvest could mean anxiety. And that explains why harvest festivals carried such importance. They were not simply celebrations of abundance. They were celebrations of survival. The community had made it through another agricultural year. Food was available. Animals were healthy. And winter preparations could begin. Then, the cycle returned to winter, and the entire process began again. This constant cycle of seasons shaped the Viking imagination. The world was not static. Everything changed. Plants grew, then disappeared. The sun weakened, then returned. Animals were born, then died. People grew older. Generations followed one another, and religious traditions reflected these patterns. Fertility, death, renewal, harvest, winter, spring. These themes appear repeatedly in the mythology and religious traditions associated with Scandinavia. The natural world was not simply scenery, it was part of life itself. And that makes Viking festivals easier to understand. When we hear the word festival, we might imagine something similar to a modern holiday, a particular date, a day off work, decorations, food, perhaps a parade. But Viking festivals were more deeply integrated into everyday life. They were connected to the agricultural cycle, to religion, to politics, and to survival. The date itself could be less important than the season. What mattered was what the landscape was doing, what people needed to do, and what the community was hoping for. This also meant that festivals could vary. A coastal community had different concerns from an inland farming settlement. A wealthy chieftain could host a much larger gathering than a poor household. A northern settlement experienced the changing daylight differently from one farther south, so there wasn't one universal Viking calendar that everyone followed in precisely the same way. Instead, there was a shared understanding of seasonal rhythms, combined with local traditions, and one seasonal period became particularly famous. Winter. The darkness. The cold. The stored food. The long nights. The firelight. The gathering of families. The religious traditions. And the great feasts. This was the world of Yule. the celebration that would eventually influence some of the traditions associated with Christmas in Scandinavia. But Viking Yule was not simply an early version of modern Christmas. It belonged to a different religious world, a world of Old Norse gods, sacred rituals, seasonal hopes, and communal feasting. And perhaps the most important thing about Yule was the feeling behind it. Winter had arrived. The harvest was finished. The community had survived another year. And now, everyone gathered together. The doors of the hall opened. Guests stepped inside from the cold. The fire burned brightly. Food was placed on the tables. Drink was prepared. Stories began. And outside, the long Scandinavian night continued. But inside, for a little while, winter didn't seem quite so frightening. So, let us follow the firelight. Let us step through those wooden doors and enter the Viking winter celebration, known as Yule. Now, the winter has fully arrived. The fields are quiet. The animals are sheltered. The work of the harvest is behind you. And outside, darkness comes early, very early. The sun disappears from the sky, and the cold settles over the landscape. But inside the longhouse, something is different. The fire is burning brightly. People are arriving. Food is being prepared. Drink is being carried into the hall, and the community is getting ready for one of the most important celebrations of the winter season, Yule. The Old Norse winter festival known as Yule is one of the traditions most strongly associated with the Viking world, and it is also one of the traditions that later became connected with Christmas. But Viking Yule was not simply Christmas with different decorations. It belonged to a pre-Christian religious world, a world of different gods, different rituals, and different ideas about the relationship between humans and the supernatural. The exact details of Yule are difficult to reconstruct, and that is worth remembering. We don't have a Viking festival schedule telling us exactly what every family did from morning until midnight. Our evidence comes from several sources: archaeology, Old Norse literature, later written accounts, place names, and traditions that survived into later Scandinavian culture. Some details are clearer than others, but one thing appears repeatedly. Yule was associated with feasting, and that makes perfect sense. After months of agricultural work, a community finally had an opportunity to gather. The harvest had already been collected. Animals were available. Stored food could be brought out. And people could share a meal on a much larger scale than an ordinary family dinner. Imagine entering the hall. You have just come in from the cold. Your clothes are heavy from the journey. Your hands are cold. Perhaps your face is still red from the wind. Then, the warmth hits you. The smell of burning wood, cooked meat, bread, porridge, and beer. People are talking everywhere. Someone is laughing. Someone is telling a story. Children are moving around the edges of the gathering. And somewhere near the centre, the host is making sure everyone has enough to eat and drink. For a powerful chieftain, a great Yule feast was also a demonstration of wealth. You could tell a lot about someone by the food they could provide. Meat was not something every household could serve in unlimited quantities. Animals were valuable. They provided milk, wool, leather, labour, and future offspring. So slaughtering an animal for a feast could represent a considerable expense. The host was essentially saying, "We have enough. We can afford to share. And I want you to remember my generosity." That last part mattered. Viking society placed enormous value on reputation. A good leader was expected to be generous. A generous person could attract followers. A respected chieftain could strengthen his position by providing food and drink to others. So the Yule feast was social, but it could also be political. People watched, they remembered, and they talked. Perhaps a neighbouring family received a particularly valuable gift. Perhaps an important guest was given a place of honour. Perhaps a marriage was discussed. Perhaps a political agreement was strengthened. All of these things could happen around the same fire. And then there was drink. Beer was an important part of Viking feasting. Ale could be brewed from grain, and different types of alcoholic drinks were available depending on region and resources. At a great celebration, people could make formal toasts. These were not necessarily casual drinks. They could have religious meaning. A toast might honour a god, remember an ancestor, celebrate an achievement, or express hopes for the future. The act of drinking together itself helped create a sense of community. Everyone participated. Everyone shared the same vessel or drinking tradition, and everyone became part of the same ceremony. One of the most interesting features of Viking feasting was this combination of the ordinary and the sacred. Eating was ordinary, drinking was ordinary, talking was ordinary. But when these things happened within a ritual setting, they could become something more. A communal act, a religious act, a political act, and a social act, all at once. The gods were never far from the imagination. Odin, Thor, Freya, Freyja, and other supernatural beings occupied different places in the religious traditions of Scandinavia. Yule traditions have sometimes been connected with Odin and with the god Freya, but the evidence is complicated. Different regions may have practiced different customs, and later writers sometimes interpreted older traditions through their own perspectives. So historians have to be careful. We can say that Yule was an important pre-Christian winter celebration. We can say that feasting and religious ritual were associated with it. But we should not pretend that we know exactly what happened in every Viking hall. History becomes more interesting when we admit what remains uncertain. One thing that seems particularly important was the hope for a successful future. Winter could be dangerous. Food supplies had to last. Animals had to survive. People had to remain healthy. And eventually, spring had to return. A festival could therefore become a moment of hope. People were looking backward, at the year that had just passed, but they were also looking forward to the year that was coming. Would the harvest be good? Would the animals remain healthy? Would the fishing be successful? Would ships return safely? Would the community remain prosperous? No one could know. So they gathered. They celebrated what they had, and hoped for what was still to come. There may also have been a strong connection between Yule and the dead. Ancestors were important within the wider Scandinavian religious world. Family identity stretched backward through generations. The dead were not simply forgotten people. Their names, stories, and reputations could continue to matter. This made winter gatherings an opportunity to remember those who had come before, and perhaps that explains something about the atmosphere of the celebration. It wasn't necessarily pure happiness. It could be serious, religious, reflective, and communal. People could laugh and remember the dead. They could feast and worry about the future. They could celebrate, while knowing that winter was still outside. Human beings have always been capable of holding several emotions at once. The Vikings were no different. And then there was storytelling. Imagine what that must have been like. The fire is burning. The meal is finished. The drinking continues. The room becomes quieter. And someone begins to speak. A story about a famous ancestor, a powerful warrior, a legendary king, a god, a monster, a voyage, a feud. Or perhaps something that happened only a generation earlier, before television, before movies, before radio, before books were available to ordinary people. Stories were entertainment, history, education, and memory. All at once, a great storyteller could hold the attention of an entire room. And during a festival, there was an audience waiting to listen. Perhaps a poet recited verses. Perhaps someone sang. Perhaps an old man told a story that everyone had already heard. But nobody minded hearing it again, because traditions survive through repetition. The children listened. They remembered. Years later, they would tell the story themselves. And so, a festival became more than a celebration of one winter. It became a bridge between generations. The old taught the young. The living remembered the dead. And the community reminded itself who it was. Outside, the night remained cold. The landscape remained dark. But inside, the celebration continued. The fire burned lower. The food slowly disappeared. The drink continued to circulate. And eventually, people began to grow tired. Perhaps some guests would remain for the night. Others would return home when it was safe. But the festival had done its work. It had brought people together. It had strengthened relationships. It had honoured tradition. And it had given everyone a brief moment of warmth in the middle of winter. Yule was therefore not simply about having fun. It was about community, faith, food, generosity, memory, and hope. And perhaps that is why the tradition survived in one form or another for so long. The names changed, the religion changed, the customs changed, but the basic human desire remained. When winter is dark, gather together, share what you have, remember those who came before, and hope that spring will return. Soon, we'll look more closely at what actually appeared on the tables during these celebrations. Because if you were invited to a great Viking feast, you might discover that the menu was considerably more interesting and occasionally more surprising than the modern image of Vikings sitting around eating nothing but enormous pieces of meat. But for now, let the hall grow quiet. The fire continues to glow. The winter wind moves outside. And somewhere in the darkness, the Viking celebration of Yule continues. After the long winter darkness, after the fires have been lit, and after the guests have finally gathered inside the warm hall, there comes the part of the festival that everyone has been waiting for, the food. Because whatever else a Viking festival may have involved, religion, politics, poetry, stories, music, or rituals, there was usually one thing that could bring almost everyone together: a good meal. For the Vikings, food was much more than something that kept the body alive. At a great feast, food could demonstrate wealth, generosity, hospitality, social position, and even the strength of a household. If a powerful chieftain invited dozens of people into his hall, he had to feed them, and not just with a few pieces of bread. A great gathering required serious preparation. Animals had to be raised, grain had to be grown, fish had to be caught, food had to be preserved, firewood had to be collected, cooking vessels had to be prepared, and people had to spend hours turning raw ingredients into something everyone could eat. So when you walked into a Viking feast, you were seeing the result of months of work, perhaps even an entire year's work. Imagine approaching a large Viking hall. The wooden walls rise around you. Smoke drifts through the roof opening. The doors open, and warm air moves toward you. Then you smell it. Cooked meat, smoke, bread, porridge, fish, herbs, and something sweet, perhaps berries or preserved fruit. You step inside. The room is crowded. People are sitting along the benches. The fire is burning, and food is being carried from one end of the hall to the other. For a wealthy household, meat could be an important part of a major feast. Cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and poultry were all raised in Viking communities. But there is an important detail we sometimes forget. Animals were valuable. A cow was not simply a piece of meat walking around. It could provide milk, it could produce calves, it could provide leather, and it represented wealth. The same was true of other livestock. So slaughtering an animal for a large feast was a meaningful decision. It was a demonstration that the household had enough resources to share. And that made meat particularly valuable at major gatherings. A feast with plenty of meat could impress guests. It could strengthen the reputation of the host. And it could remind everyone that the household was prosperous. But Vikings didn't live on meat alone. Far from it. Grains were extremely important. Barley was one of the major crops. It could be turned into porridge, bread, and beer. Rye and oats were also important in different regions, and the exact crops depended on where people lived. Scandinavia is enormous. The climate in one region could be very different from another, so there was no single Viking diet. A coastal community had access to different foods from an inland farming settlement. A wealthy household could obtain foods that poorer families rarely enjoyed, and a settlement in Norway could have a different menu from one in Denmark or Sweden. But grains were a common foundation. Imagine a large pot hanging over the fire. Inside, a thick porridge is slowly cooking. Perhaps grains have been mixed with milk. Perhaps other ingredients have been added. It isn't glamorous, but it is filling. And for people doing physically demanding work, that mattered. Then there was bread. Viking bread was not necessarily the soft, fluffy loaf many of us know today. It could be dense, flat, coarse, and made from locally available grains. Some breads could contain seeds or other ingredients. Others were very simple. But bread was practical. It could be stored, carried, and eaten alongside other foods. Then there was fish. And here, the Viking world had a major advantage. Water. Lots of it. Scandinavia has enormous coastlines, thousands of lakes, rivers, fjords, and access to the North Atlantic. Fishing could therefore provide an important source of food. Depending on the region, people could eat species such as cod, herring, salmon, and many others. Fish could be eaten fresh, but preservation was especially important. It could be dried, smoked, salted, or otherwise preserved. That allowed communities to keep food for much longer. And in a world without refrigeration, preservation could make the difference between having food and not having food. The same principle applied to meat. Food could be dried, smoked, salted, or stored under suitable conditions. Viking households had to think ahead. Winter was coming. And once winter arrived, fresh food could become much harder to obtain. So the food sitting on the festival table wasn't simply there because someone happened to feel hungry. It represented planning, work, storage, and survival. Vegetables were also important. Viking farmers could grow or gather various plants: cabbage, peas, beans, onions, and herbs. Wild plants and berries could add flavor and variety. Depending on the season, people could gather fruits, nuts, mushrooms, and other foods from the surrounding landscape. Honey was another valuable ingredient. It could be used as a sweetener. And it was particularly important because sugar, as we know it today, was not part of ordinary Viking cooking. So imagine tasting a Viking dish. It wouldn't necessarily taste like modern Scandinavian food. There would be no familiar supermarket ingredients from around the world. No tomatoes, no potatoes, no chocolate, no modern sugar, no tropical fruits arriving by airplane. The flavors came from what the land, sea, animals, and local trade could provide. And that brings us to another important point. Not every Viking feast was equally impressive. A wealthy chieftain could provide much more than an ordinary farmer. A great hall might have access to imported goods, spices, fine drink, special foods, and valuable ingredients brought from distant places. An ordinary farming family had to work with what they could grow, raise, catch, or trade for. So when we imagine a Viking feast, we shouldn't imagine every person in Scandinavia eating an enormous banquet every week. Most people lived much more modestly. Festivals were special precisely because they were different from ordinary meals. That difference mattered. If you eat expensive food every day, it stops feeling special. But if most meals are simple, a major feast becomes memorable. And people remembered memorable meals, especially when they were connected with important events. A wedding, a religious festival, a successful harvest, a political gathering, or the arrival of an important guest. Food could become part of the story. Years later, someone might remember the feast. Who was there? What was served? What happened? Who drank too much? Who told the best story? And perhaps, who accidentally fell asleep beside the fire? Again, human nature hasn't changed very much. But there was another reason food mattered. Generosity. A Viking host was judged partly by how well guests were treated. Hospitality was important. If someone travelled a long distance to reach your home, you were expected to offer them food and shelter. At a major festival, that expectation became even stronger. The host had an opportunity to demonstrate his character. A generous host gained respect. A stingy host might gain something else. A reputation. And reputation mattered enormously in Viking society. People remembered who helped them, who welcomed them, who gave gifts, who provided food, and who refused. So the feast wasn't just about eating. It was about relationships. A plate of food could strengthen an alliance. A drink could establish friendship. A gift could create an obligation, and a seat beside an important person could signal status. Everything happening inside the hall could have social meaning. Even where you sat, the most honoured guests might receive better positions. People of lower status might sit farther away. The arrangement of the hall itself could reflect the structure of society. And yet, for a few hours, everyone was participating in the same event. The fire warmed the room, food was shared, drink circulated, and stories filled the space between the meals. Perhaps someone performed a poem. Perhaps an old family story was told. Perhaps a traveller described something they had seen in another country. The feast became a living exchange of information. And this is something we often miss when we imagine Viking festivals. The food was only part of the experience. The real feast was everything happening around it. The conversations, the relationships, the rituals, the memories, the laughter, the arguments, the promises, and the stories. Still, if there was one thing that could make a feast truly memorable, it was what everyone drank. And the Vikings had a surprisingly important relationship with drink. Beer, ale, mead, and other alcoholic beverages could all have their place. But they weren't simply refreshments. They could be connected to ceremony, status, hospitality, and religion. So in the next chapter, we'll stay inside the hall. The food has been served. The guests are comfortable. The fire is glowing. And now, the drinking begins. Because for the Vikings, a great feast was rarely complete without something to raise in a cup and a reason to make a toast. The food has been served. The hall is warm. People have settled onto the benches. And now, someone brings out the drink. For the Vikings, drinking was about much more than simply becoming intoxicated. At a great gathering, sharing drink could be part of hospitality, religion, politics, friendship, and social tradition. The most common drink was probably some form of ale or beer. Grain was fermented, and the resulting drink could be produced in different strengths and styles. The exact ingredients varied from place to place. Some brews could include herbs or other flavourings, and the taste would have been very different from the neatly packaged beer sitting in a modern refrigerator. But beer had one major advantage. The Vikings could make it locally. They didn't need to import every drink from somewhere far away. Grain could be grown, fermented, and turned into something that could be stored and shared. For a farming community, that was useful. And during a festival, it became something more, a symbol of hospitality. Imagine a guest arriving at a Viking hall. The host doesn't simply point toward an empty chair. Food is offered, drink is offered, the guest is welcomed. That act of hospitality could create a relationship. And relationships were extremely important in Viking society. If you travelled through another settlement, you depended on the generosity of others. If you were welcomed, you remembered it. If you were refused, you probably remembered that too. So giving someone food and drink wasn't necessarily an insignificant gesture. It could communicate respect, trust, and friendship. Then there was mead. Mead was made using honey, and honey was valuable. Bees had to produce it, people had to collect it, and honey had many uses. It could be eaten, used as a sweetener, and fermented into a drink. Because honey was relatively precious, mead could carry a sense of luxury. This is one reason modern popular culture has become so fascinated with Viking mead. The image is perfect. A huge wooden hall, a warrior lifting a drinking horn, golden liquid shining in the firelight, someone shouting a toast, everyone drinking together. It certainly makes a good scene. But the real Viking drinking culture was probably less theatrical than modern movies suggest. Not everyone necessarily drank from enormous horns at every meal. Different vessels existed. Wooden cups, ceramic vessels, glass in wealthy contexts, and horns. Drinking horns certainly existed, but the giant horn held by every Viking warrior in every movie is more of a modern visual tradition than a universal historical reality. The same goes for the idea that every Viking spent every evening getting spectacularly drunk. Most people had responsibilities. Someone had to feed the animals tomorrow. Someone had to repair the roof. Someone had to work in the fields. Someone had to go fishing. Someone had to sail. Someone had to take care of the children. And someone, eventually, had to clean up after the feast. So drinking had limits. At least, in theory. Because festivals could still involve plenty of alcohol. And alcohol could change the atmosphere of a gathering. People became louder. Stories became more dramatic. Confidence increased. And occasionally, someone said something they probably should not have said. Again, this is not uniquely Viking. It is simply human. But drinking had another important function. Toasting. A toast could be more than saying, "Cheers." It could have religious or social significance. People might drink in honor of a god, an ancestor, a ruler, a successful event, or a hoped-for future. Imagine the hall becoming quieter. A respected person stands. A cup or vessel is raised. A few words are spoken. Everyone listens. Then, the drink is shared. The moment connects everyone in the room. And that is why communal drinking could be powerful. Everyone participates in the same action. Everyone hears the same words. Everyone acknowledges the same person or event. It creates unity. There was also a political dimension. A chieftain who hosted a major feast was demonstrating his ability to provide. He had enough food, enough drink, enough space, and enough influence to bring important people together. The feast became a public display of generosity. Imagine two leaders. One offers his guests a small meal. The other fills the hall with food, drink, entertainment, and gifts. Which leader is likely to be remembered as generous? The answer is obvious, and reputation mattered. Viking society relied heavily on personal relationships. A leader couldn't simply depend on an enormous government bureaucracy. He needed people who were personally loyal, followers, friends, relatives, warriors, allies, and clients. Generosity helped maintain those relationships. A feast could therefore strengthen a political network. Someone who ate at your table might later fight beside you, trade with you, support your family, or help you during a dispute. The food disappeared, but the obligation could remain. This idea of gift-giving was extremely important. If someone gave you something valuable, you were often expected to respond, not necessarily immediately, but eventually. A gift could create a relationship, and feasting was one of the easiest places for these relationships to develop. The hall itself, therefore, became an important social space. People gathered there. They ate. They drank. They listened. They argued. They negotiated. They celebrated. And sometimes, they settled serious disputes. The same room could be a dining hall, a religious space, a political meeting place, and an entertainment venue. Imagine sitting on one of those benches. Across from you, a farmer is talking about the harvest. Beside him, a traveller is describing a distant settlement. At the other end of the room, a poet is preparing to perform. Near the doorway, someone has just arrived with news. And at the centre, the host is making sure everyone has enough to drink. The hall is alive. Not because of television, not because of music playing through speakers, not because of flashing lights, but because people themselves are creating the entertainment. Conversation, stories, poetry, songs, arguments, laughter, and memory. And as the night continues, the boundary between celebration and ceremony can become less obvious. A drink might be offered to the gods. A toast might honour the dead. A story might explain the family's ancestry. A song might preserve an old tradition. The feast becomes a way of remembering who the community is. This is why Viking festivals mattered. They weren't simply breaks from everyday life. They helped reinforce everyday life. They reminded people of their relationships, their traditions, their obligations, their beliefs, and their place within the community. But there was another side to Viking feasting, one that could be much more serious. Sometimes, the gathering involved an actual religious ritual. an offering, a sacrifice, a ceremony intended to maintain a relationship between humans and the supernatural world. And when we reach that part of the festival, the atmosphere could change. The laughter might quiet, the drinking could become ceremonial, and the community would turn its attention toward the gods. The ritual known as blot would become one of the most important elements of certain pre-Christian Scandinavian religious gatherings. So, the cups remain on the table. The fire continues to burn. The hall is still crowded. But the mood is beginning to change. Because this isn't simply dinner anymore. The Vikings have gathered for something more serious. They are about to make an offering and ask the supernatural world for something in return. In the next chapter, we'll step into the religious heart of the Viking festival. Blot. The ritual of sacrifice, offerings, gods, and communal feasting. The hall is still warm. The fire still burns. The smell of food still hangs in the air. But now, the mood has changed. The laughter becomes quieter. People begin paying closer attention, because the celebration is moving towards something more serious. A religious ritual. One of the old Norse words associated with sacrifice and religious offerings was blot. And when we hear the word sacrifice today, we often imagine something dramatic, something frightening, something from a horror story. But in the Viking world, a religious sacrifice could be understood as part of a relationship between humans and the supernatural. People needed things: good harvests, healthy animals, successful voyages, protection, prosperity, and sometimes victory. The gods were believed to have power over parts of this uncertain world, so people made offerings. They gave something, and hoped for something in return. It was not necessarily a simple transaction. Religion rarely works quite that neatly. But the basic idea of reciprocity was important. Humans honoured the gods, and hoped the gods would favour them. A blot could involve an animal sacrifice. Our written sources describe animals being killed as offerings during certain religious gatherings. The blood could have ritual significance. The meat could then become part of a communal feast. And this is one of the fascinating things about Viking religious practice. The sacred and the ordinary were often connected. The same animal could be part of a religious ceremony and then become food for the people gathered there. The sacrifice was not simply about destruction. The community could share in the resulting meal. Imagine the preparation. People have gathered from nearby farms. The animals have been selected. The hall has been prepared. Food is being cooked. Drink is ready. And now, the ritual begins. We have to be careful here. The exact details of blot are not completely known. Our sources were written down after the Viking Age had already begun to change, and Christian writers sometimes described pagan practices through their own perspectives. Archaeology provides clues, but rarely gives us a complete script, so historians can reconstruct parts of the picture, but not every movement, not every word, not every prayer, and not every ritual. Still, we know enough to understand the basic importance of sacrifice. It could be communal, it could be religious, and it could be connected to important moments in the agricultural year. One particularly important concern was fertility, and fertility didn't simply mean having children. It could mean fertile fields, healthy animals, successful harvests, and a prosperous community. For a farming society, these things were essential. A farmer could work from sunrise to sunset, but still depend on forces beyond his control. Rain, sun, cold, disease, storms, pests, and the mysterious behavior of nature. So religious rituals provided a way of expressing hopes about the future. People couldn't control everything, but they could ask, they could offer, they could pray, and they could gather together in solidarity. This made religious festivals emotionally powerful. Everyone had something to hope for. The farmer wanted a good harvest. The sailor wanted a safe voyage. The family wanted healthy children. The chieftain wanted prosperity. The community wanted stability. And everyone wanted to survive the next difficult season. Different gods could be associated with different hopes. Thor was strongly associated with strength and protection. Freya was associated in later sources with fertility and prosperity. Freyja had important connections to fertility, love, magic, and other aspects of the supernatural world. And Odin was an extraordinarily complex figure. He was associated with wisdom, war, death, poetry, magic, and many other things. The Viking religious world was not a simple system where one god controlled one department of life. The gods overlapped. Their stories were complicated, and local traditions could vary. Still, their presence in the imagination of Viking communities was powerful. A festival could therefore become a moment when the community collectively acknowledged that supernatural world. And after the ritual, the feast could begin. This connection between sacrifice and feasting is particularly important. People didn't necessarily separate religion from eating. A sacred ceremony could lead directly into a communal meal. The animal offered during the ritual could become food, drink could be shared, toasts could be made, and the community could eat together. The feast itself could therefore reinforce the religious experience. Everyone was participating. Everyone was sharing. Everyone was part of the same event. There was another important element: memory. Religious traditions were often connected to ancestors. The dead mattered. Families remembered their predecessors. Stories about earlier generations were repeated, and the supernatural world could include the spirits or continuing presence of the dead. So a festival could connect three things: the past, the present, and the future. The past, through ancestors and tradition; the present, through the people gathered together; and the future, through hopes for prosperity and survival. That makes the ritual more understandable. It wasn't simply, let's perform a strange ceremony. It was a way of placing the community within a much larger story. They were part of a family, a settlement, a landscape, a religious tradition, and a chain of generations. The ritual reminded them of that. And then, the food was shared. The drink was raised. People talked. Stories were told. And the community returned to celebration. But there was another interesting aspect of Viking religious gatherings. They could be connected with political authority. A powerful leader could have an important role in organizing or hosting a religious feast. This meant religion and leadership could overlap. A chieftain who provided food, drink, space, and ritual was not simply being generous. He was demonstrating authority. He was showing that he could bring people together. He could support the community. And perhaps he could maintain the relationship between the community and the gods. That would make religious festivals politically important. The hall became a place where faith and power met. People gathered. They ate. They drank. They listened. They watched. And the leader stood at the center of it all. But perhaps the most interesting part was that these rituals weren't necessarily terrifying to the people participating in them. To us, an animal sacrifice can sound disturbing. But within their worldview, it could be a normal religious practice, just as different societies throughout history have developed different ways of expressing devotion. The Vikings had their own. It was familiar, traditional, and connected to the world they understood. The supernatural was not separate from everyday life. It was woven into it. The weather, the harvest, the sea, birth, death, illness, luck, and fate. All could be interpreted through a religious lens. So when the community gathered for a blot, they were not simply performing an old custom. They were acknowledging the forces they believed shaped their lives. And once the ceremony was complete, the feast could continue. The atmosphere would gradually become lighter. The cups would be raised again. Food would circulate. Someone would begin telling a story, perhaps a story about a god. And soon, the names of the gods would become part of the evening. Odin, Thor, Freya, Freyja, each with their own stories, their own personalities, their own powers, and their own complicated relationships with humans. So in the next chapter, we'll move closer to those gods themselves. We'll explore why Vikings honoured different deities, what they hoped to receive from them, and how the gods became woven into the celebrations of ordinary people. The fire is still burning, the feast is still underway, and somewhere in the hall, someone has just begun telling a story about Thor. The story has begun, the fire crackles, the room is warm, and around the hall, people are listening. Someone speaks the name of Thor. Perhaps another person mentions Odin. Someone else remembers Freyr. And somewhere among the stories, Frasier appears. To modern ears, these names are familiar. They have become characters in books, films, games, and television. But for people living in the Viking Age, these were not simply entertaining characters from ancient stories. They belonged to a religious world, a world in which gods could influence human lives, and where people hoped those gods would listen. The Vikings did not necessarily think of their gods as distant beings living completely separate from humanity. The relationship could be much more complicated. People might ask the gods for help, offer gifts, make sacrifices, raise ritual toasts, tell stories, and seek protection or prosperity. Different gods could have different associations, and the same god could have several. Take Thor. Today, Thor is probably one of the most recognizable figures from Norse mythology. He carries his famous hammer, Mjolnir, and is associated with thunder and extraordinary strength. But for Viking communities, Thor could represent something much more practical: protection, strength, and the defense of the human world against dangerous forces. For farmers, fishermen, travelers, and families, protection was important. Life could change quickly. Storms could destroy crops. The sea could become dangerous. Enemies could arrive. And illness could strike without warning. A god associated with strength and protection could therefore have enormous appeal. Thor was not only a figure of mythology. His name appears in personal names and place names across Scandinavia. And small hammer-shaped objects have been discovered archaeologically. These miniature hammers may have been worn as symbols of religious identity. Imagine someone wearing a tiny hammer around their neck, not as a fashion statement, but as a visible reminder of the god they trusted. Perhaps it was a symbol of protection, perhaps identity, perhaps devotion, or perhaps several things at once. Then there was Odin. And Odin was a very different figure. Where Thor is often remembered for strength, Odin is associated with wisdom, knowledge, poetry, magic, war, and death. He is a complicated god, and perhaps that complexity is exactly what made him fascinating. Odin was not simply the wise old man of Norse mythology. He could be mysterious, deceptive, demanding, and dangerous. Stories about him often involve sacrifice and the pursuit of knowledge. He is famously associated with gaining wisdom through suffering and sacrifice, and he was closely connected with warriors and the dead. For Viking warriors, that connection could be especially important. Battle was dangerous, death was real, and people wanted to understand what might happen after it. The mythology surrounding Odin offered one way of imagining that mysterious world. But Odin wasn't necessarily the god every ordinary farmer would focus on. Different communities, different individuals, and different situations could inspire devotion to different gods. And then there was Freyr. Freyr is especially interesting when we think about festivals. He is strongly associated in the sources with fertility, peace, prosperity, and abundance. These were not abstract concepts for Viking farmers. They were survival. A good harvest meant food. Healthy animals meant wealth. Peace meant fewer disruptions. Prosperity meant security. So a god connected with these things could be extremely important. A farmer might not dream about heroic battles. He might simply want his crops to grow, his animals to remain healthy, and his family to survive the winter. That is where religious practice becomes very understandable. People prayed for the things they needed. And then there was Freyja. Freyja is one of the most fascinating figures in the Norse religious tradition. She is associated with love, desire, fertility, and beauty, but also with magic and death. She is far more complicated than the simplified image of a goddess of love. She is connected with Sire, a form of magic or sorcery described in the sources, and she has an unusual relationship with the fallen dead. According to later sources, she receives a portion of warriors who die in battle. The rest are associated with Odin. So even here, the boundaries between gods are not simple, and that's important. The Viking religious world wasn't a neat chart. It wasn't, Thor does this, Odin does that, Freyr handles this, and Frasier handles that. The gods could overlap, stories changed, regional traditions differed, and people could have relationships with several deities. The same person might honor Thor, respect Odin, and participate in a festival associated with Freyr. There was no requirement to choose only one. Religion was part of life, not necessarily a rigid membership system, and festivals provided opportunities to express these relationships. A feast could include ritual drinking, a sacrifice could be made, a god could be invoked, a story could be told, and people could collectively hope for good fortune. The language of the rituals matters too. A toast was not always simply, "to the gods." It could express a specific hope, for peace, for a good harvest, for prosperity, for protection, or for the memory of someone who had died. In a world where people depended heavily on forces beyond their control, these hopes were serious, and they could make festivals emotionally powerful. Imagine standing inside a Viking hall. The room is crowded. Someone raises a drinking vessel. Everyone becomes quiet. The person speaks. Perhaps the words are familiar. Perhaps they have been repeated for generations. Then, everyone drinks. For a moment, the entire room is united. Different families, different occupations, different personalities, different social positions, all participating in the same ritual. That is the power of ceremony. It turns many individuals into a community, and Viking communities needed that unity. Life could be uncertain, conflicts could arise, families could compete, people could disagree, but festivals gave them a shared identity. They belonged to the same community. They remembered the same stories. They honored the same traditions. And they hoped for the same future. This also explains why religious festivals could be connected with political power. A chieftain who hosted a great feast could present himself as generous. A leader who organized religious gatherings could demonstrate authority. A household that possessed enough food and drink to feed many people was clearly prosperous, and prosperity created respect. So the gods were present, but so was human ambition. The Viking hall could be both sacred and political, and perhaps that's one of the reasons these festivals were so important. They connected almost every part of life. Religion, food, family, politics, agriculture, memory, and entertainment. Nothing existed entirely by itself. The same feast could honor a god, strengthen an alliance, celebrate a marriage, and feed 50 hungry people. The same story could entertain children, teach history, and preserve religious beliefs. The same drinking ritual could be social, religious, and political. Everything overlapped. And eventually, the stories would become even more important. Because when the feast grew quieter and the food began disappearing, someone would inevitably start telling a story. Perhaps about Odin, perhaps about Thor, perhaps about Freyr, perhaps about Frasier, or perhaps about some long-forgotten ancestor. The children would listen, the adults would remember, and the story would travel from one generation to the next. But before the year moves forward, before spring returns, we need to remain in the darkness a little longer. Because the Viking winter wasn't only about Yule. The coming of spring itself could become a moment worth celebrating. After months of cold, after long nights, after surviving another difficult season, the first signs of returning life would have enormous meaning. The snow would begin to disappear. The days would grow longer. The fields would become usable again, and the world would slowly wake. So, let the fire burn a little longer. Let the stories of the gods fade into the background, and imagine the first pale light of spring appearing over the Scandinavian horizon. The darkest part of the year is passing. The fields are waiting. the animals are becoming active, and the Vikings are preparing to welcome the return of spring. Winter has begun to loosen its grip. The nights are still cold, the ground may still be wet and frozen, and snow can remain in the northern landscapes for a long time. But something has changed. The days are getting longer. The sun stays above the horizon a little more each evening. Water begins moving beneath the ice. The fields slowly become visible again, and after months of darkness, the world is beginning to wake. For the Vikings, this was not simply a pleasant change in weather. Spring meant that life could begin moving again. The winter stores had been getting smaller. Animals had survived the cold months. People had spent much of the winter indoors. And now, the agricultural year was beginning again. Fields needed to be prepared. Seeds needed to be planted. Animals needed to be moved and cared for. Boats could once again travel more easily. And the long period of relative inactivity was coming to an end. Imagine a Viking household at this moment. For months, the family has depended on food that was prepared and stored before winter. There was no supermarket nearby, no truck arriving with fresh vegetables, no refrigerator filled with food from around the world. What you had was what you had stored. So when spring finally arrived, it brought relief. Fresh plants could begin appearing. Animals could graze again. Fish became easier to obtain in some areas, and the possibility of another successful harvest was beginning. Spring was therefore a season of hope, but it was also a season of work, a lot of work. The fields had to be prepared. Tools needed repairing. Fences needed rebuilding. Animals needed attention. And everyone had to begin thinking about the coming months. The Vikings lived in a world where survival depended on preparation. You couldn't wait until the last moment. If you needed hay for winter, you had to collect it during summer. If you needed grain, you had to grow it during the agricultural season. If you needed firewood, you had to gather it before the cold returned. The entire year was connected. One season prepared you for the next. And that made the arrival of spring especially meaningful. It was the beginning of another cycle, another opportunity, another chance to get things right. It is easy for us to underestimate how powerful that feeling could have been. Today, spring can simply mean warmer weather, maybe flowers, maybe longer evenings, maybe cleaning the house. But for a Viking farmer, spring could mean we have another year ahead of us. That was something worth celebrating. Religious traditions could also reflect this concern with fertility and renewal. The natural world was returning. Plants were growing. Animals were reproducing. The fields were becoming productive again. And people hoped that this renewal would continue. This is one reason gods associated with fertility and prosperity could be important during seasonal celebrations. Freyr, in particular, was associated in the surviving sources with fertility, peace, and prosperity. Those were precisely the things a farming community needed. A farmer didn't necessarily need a heroic adventure. He needed rain at the right time, sunlight at the right time, healthy animals, good crops, and enough food to make it through the next winter. The religious world provided a language for those hopes. People could offer gifts, perform rituals, make prayers, and gather together. Again, we should remember that the exact spring ceremonies varied. There was no single Viking spring festival that every Scandinavian community celebrated in exactly the same way. Different regions had different traditions, and the evidence isn't complete. But seasonal celebrations were clearly connected with the rhythm of agricultural and religious life. And there was something else that happened when spring arrived. People could finally travel more easily. During the worst parts of winter, snow, ice, darkness, and storms could make journeys difficult. But as conditions improved, movement increased. People could visit neighbouring settlements. Merchants could travel. Ships could prepare for voyages, and news could begin moving again. For a society spread across enormous distances, this mattered. A gathering in spring could bring together people who hadn't seen one another for months. Imagine a traveller arriving at your settlement. They have come from somewhere several days away. They bring news. Perhaps a ship has arrived from another region. Perhaps a powerful chieftain has died. Perhaps a marriage has been arranged. Perhaps a trading opportunity has appeared. Perhaps someone has returned from a distant journey. News travelled through people. And festivals and gatherings were perfect places for news to spread. A celebration could therefore serve as a kind of social information network. No newspaper, no internet, no television, just people. Talking, listening, remembering, and repeating what they had heard. Of course, that also meant rumours could spread very quickly. One person tells another person adds a detail, someone else misunderstands it, and by the time the story reaches the next settlement, it may be completely different. Again, human nature has not changed much. But spring wasn't only about farmers and travellers. It was also a time of preparation for the sea. For Viking communities with strong maritime traditions, the warmer season opened possibilities. Ships could travel, trade could expand, and expeditions could begin. The famous Viking voyages that we hear so much about were therefore connected to the seasonal rhythm. A ship couldn't simply sail anywhere at any time. Weather mattered, sea conditions mattered, food supplies mattered, and daylight mattered. The long summer days would eventually provide much more favourable conditions for travel, so spring was preparation, ships were repaired, equipment was checked, supplies were gathered, crews were organised, and plans were made. Some people would remain home, others would leave, and everyone would know that another cycle of journeys was beginning. But for those staying behind, there was still plenty of work. The fields needed attention, the animals needed care, and the coming harvest needed to be prepared. The Viking year was not divided into neat categories of work and leisure. One flowed into the other. Even celebration had a practical purpose. A festival could mark the beginning of a new season, while also strengthening the relationships people needed to survive it. Neighbours who celebrated together could help one another later. Families who strengthened their bonds could cooperate when times became difficult. Leaders who demonstrated generosity could maintain loyalty. So even a cheerful spring gathering could have serious consequences. It could strengthen the community. And a strong community was valuable, because the coming months would not necessarily be easy. Summer was approaching, and with it, the busiest season of the year. The days would become extraordinarily long in the north. The fields would demand attention, animals would need care, food would need to be produced, ships would prepare to leave, and eventually, the great summer celebrations would arrive. But for now, the most important thing was simply that the darkness was retreating, the sun was returning, the land was becoming green again, and after months of depending on stored food, the first signs of a new growing season were appearing. Imagine standing outside a Viking settlement in early spring. The air is still cold, the ground is muddy, the trees are beginning to change, birds have returned. A thin stream of water moves through the landscape. Behind you, smoke rises from the wooden houses. Ahead, the fields stretch into the distance. There is work waiting. But there is also possibility. Another harvest could come. Another winter could be survived. Another year could begin. And for a moment, the people of the settlement can simply breathe. Winter is ending. The sun is returning. The world is waking. And the Vikings are ready for another year. Soon, the days will become longer. Much longer. The sun will seem reluctant to disappear. The sea will open. The fields will grow. And people will gather again. Because if winter was a time for surviving the darkness, summer was a time for making the most of the light. And that brings us to one of the most fascinating seasonal celebrations of all, midsummer. The time when the Scandinavian summer reached its brightest, and the nights became so short that darkness itself seemed almost to disappear. Winter had finally disappeared. Spring had passed. The fields were green. The animals were out. The ships were moving across the water. And now, the Scandinavian summer had reached its brightest point. The days were incredibly long, and the farther north you travelled, the stranger the daylight became. The sun could remain visible for most of the night. In some northern regions, it barely seemed to disappear at all. For modern people, this can sound beautiful. For the Vikings, it was also incredibly practical. Long daylight meant more time to work, more time to travel, more time to fish, more time to tend animals, more time to work the fields, and more time to prepare for the coming winter. But the longest days of the year were also an opportunity to celebrate. The summer solstice, or the period around it, marked an important seasonal transition. The sun had reached its highest point. The days had reached their maximum length. And after this moment, the days would slowly begin getting shorter again. For people whose lives were closely connected to sunlight, that mattered. The sun wasn't simply something pleasant in the sky. It controlled the rhythm of work, travel, agriculture, and daily life. So when the year reached its brightest point, people noticed. The exact nature of pre-Christian Viking midsummer celebrations is difficult to reconstruct. There isn't a single surviving Viking manual explaining precisely how every community celebrated. Different areas had different customs. And much of what we know about later, Scandinavian midsummer traditions, comes from periods after Christianity had already transformed the region. So we should be careful not to simply take a modern Scandinavian midsummer celebration and place it directly into the Viking Age. But the seasonal importance of midsummer is clear, and seasonal gatherings were certainly part of Scandinavian life. Imagine one of these summer gatherings. Unlike a winter feast, there is no need to squeeze everyone into a dark hall. People can spend more time outdoors. The weather is warmer, the fields are alive, the sky remains bright, and people can travel much more easily. A gathering might therefore feel completely different from Yule. Winter is about warmth, shelter, firelight, and surviving darkness. Summer is about openness, light, movement, and abundance. Food is available. Animals are grazing. Fish are plentiful in some regions. And the landscape is producing things again. This abundance could make summer celebrations especially enjoyable. People could gather outside, talk, eat, drink, and enjoy the strange northern light. And there was something almost magical about the summer nights. Imagine walking outside at midnight and discovering that the world is still bright. The horizon hasn't disappeared into complete darkness. The sky remains pale. The landscape is visible. And somewhere in the distance, people are still awake. For modern people, midnight usually means darkness. For a Viking living far north, summer midnight could be a completely different experience. It could blur the boundary between day and night. And perhaps that helped make summer celebrations feel different from ordinary life. The long daylight also meant that people could stay awake later. There was less pressure to retreat indoors. People could talk around fires, tell stories, visit neighbours, and continue celebrations long into what would normally be the night. Of course, someone still had to work the next morning. The fields weren't going to tend themselves. But perhaps that was exactly why these celebrations were valuable. Life was demanding. Summer was busy. So a gathering offered a chance to pause. Even if only briefly, food once again played an important role. The exact foods depended on location and season, but summer offered access to fresh ingredients that had been much harder to obtain during winter. Fresh dairy products, fish, meat, wild berries, herbs, and early crops. The contrast with winter could be enormous. During the cold months, people relied heavily on stored food. During summer, the landscape itself became a source of fresh possibilities. That could create a sense of abundance, and abundance was something worth celebrating. But summer also had a serious side. The harvest was still ahead. The food growing in the fields had not yet been safely stored. A successful summer did not guarantee a successful year. Storms could still destroy crops. Drought could cause problems. Animals could become sick. And bad weather could ruin months of work. So even during celebration, the future remained uncertain. The Vikings knew that. They had no modern agricultural technology, no weather forecasting system capable of giving precise warnings, and no easy way to replace a failed harvest. A festival could therefore be both celebration and hope. People enjoyed what they had, while hoping that the rest of the season would go well. Religion could naturally become part of those hopes. Fertility, good weather, healthy animals, successful crops, prosperity. These were concerns that could be expressed through religious traditions. And once again, Freyr becomes particularly interesting. In later Old Norse sources, Freyr is associated with fertility and prosperity. the things a farming community desperately wanted. The summer landscape itself could seem like evidence of fertility. Plants were growing, animals were reproducing, the fields were changing, and the sun was providing long hours of light. People lived inside this cycle. They didn't simply observe nature, they depended on it. That dependence shaped their worldview, and it shaped their celebrations. But midsummer wasn't only about religion, it was also about people. Large gatherings gave communities opportunities to interact. Young people could meet, families could negotiate marriages, merchants could exchange goods, travelers could share information, and leaders could demonstrate generosity. This was especially important in a world where people did not have constant communication. If someone lived several days away, a major seasonal gathering might be one of the few opportunities to meet. That made festivals, social events as much as religious ones. And there was another advantage. Summer travel was easier. A gathering could therefore attract people from a wider area. Imagine arriving at a midsummer gathering after travelling for days. You see people from neighbouring farms, perhaps traders from farther away, perhaps relatives you haven't seen since the previous season. You hear different accents, different stories, different news. Someone has brought an unusual object from a distant market. Someone else has returned from a voyage. Another person has news about a neighbouring settlement. The gathering becomes a temporary centre of the local world. For a few days, everyone is there, and everyone has something to talk about. Then, as evening arrives, the strange northern light remains. People sit around fires. The flames flicker. The sky stays pale. Someone begins telling a story. Children are still awake. Adults continue talking. And perhaps someone begins singing. Music and poetry were important forms of entertainment in Norse culture. Skalds, poets, and storytellers could preserve history and reputation through words. A great poem could keep a person's name alive long after their death, so a festival was an ideal place for performance. The audience was already there. The atmosphere was right, and everyone was paying attention. The story might be heroic, funny, sad, or supernatural. Perhaps it tells of a famous warrior, perhaps a god, perhaps an ancestor, and perhaps the audience already knows the ending. That didn't necessarily make it less enjoyable. Stories were meant to be remembered, and repetition was part of how culture survived. The Vikings had no mass media, no printed newspapers, no recorded films, no streaming services. Memory was the archive. People were the library, and festivals were where that knowledge could be shared. So as the midsummer gathering continues, the celebration becomes more than an evening of food and drink. It becomes a meeting point between generations, between families, between communities, and between the old traditions and the people who will carry them forward. But summer could not last forever, even in the far north. Eventually, the days would begin shortening. The sun would rise a little later, set a little earlier, and the fields would move toward maturity. The green crops would become ready. The animals would grow. The stores would need to be prepared, and the people would begin looking toward the next great stage of the Viking year, the harvest. Because after months of sunlight, work, and growth, the moment would finally arrive when the Vikings could discover whether all their effort had paid off. Would the fields produce enough? Would the animals be healthy? Would there be enough food for winter? The answers could determine the quality of the months ahead. So the brightness of midsummer slowly begins to fade. The fires burn beneath the pale northern sky. The laughter continues. But somewhere in the distance, the first signs of autumn are approaching. And soon, the Vikings will gather again. This time, not simply to celebrate the longest days, but to give thanks for the food that could carry them through another winter. The harvest is coming. Summer is beginning to fade. The days are still warm, but the evenings are becoming cooler. The fields that were once green are changing colour. Grain is bending beneath its own weight. The animals are growing. And everywhere, people are watching the crops. Because now comes one of the most important moments of the entire Viking year, the harvest. For a modern person, harvest might sound like a simple agricultural task. Farmers collect crops. Machines do most of the work. The food goes into storage, and eventually, it reaches supermarkets. But for a Viking community, harvest was much more serious. The harvest could determine whether people ate comfortably during winter or struggled to survive. Everything depended on what happened in these weeks. Too little food, and winter became dangerous. Enough food, and the community could face the cold months with confidence. So when the harvest succeeded, people had a very good reason to celebrate. Imagine walking through a Viking settlement during harvest time. The fields are busy, people are cutting grain, bundles are being gathered, animals are being moved, food is being transported, and everyone is working. There is no room for laziness. A storm could arrive, rain could damage crops, and harvested grain still had to be processed and stored properly. One mistake could cost a household precious food. So the harvest wasn't necessarily a cheerful festival from beginning to end. First, there was work, a tremendous amount of it. But once enough food had been safely gathered, the mood could change. People could finally breathe. The community had made it through another agricultural season. And now, it was time to give thanks. Harvest celebrations could be connected with religious practices. People might thank the gods for prosperity, offer food or drink, and hope that the coming winter would be manageable. Again, we have to be careful about reconstructing a single universal Viking harvest festival. The evidence for specific rituals varies, but the importance of harvest and the connection between food, religion, and communal feasting is much easier to understand, because food was never guaranteed. That fact shaped everything. A farmer could plant carefully, work constantly, and still lose the crop. Weather could ruin everything. Disease could affect animals, pests could destroy plants, and a particularly harsh winter could consume stored supplies faster than expected. So abundance itself could feel almost miraculous. The full storage room was a symbol of security. Grain, dried meat, fish, cheese, butter, and other preserved foods could all represent future survival. And once people knew that enough food had been stored, they could celebrate. The feast became a reward for surviving another year. And perhaps the most important part of the celebration was sharing. A household could invite neighbours, relatives, friends, workers, and important guests. Food that had taken months to produce was placed on the table. Drink was served, and people gathered together. This was generosity, but it was also practical. Strong communities mattered. If your neighbour needed help, you might need them later. If your family faced trouble, your relationships could become essential. A festival strengthened those relationships. The same people who ate together during the harvest might work together during the next crisis. And the leader of the community had an especially important role. A powerful chieftain could use a harvest feast to demonstrate his generosity. He had enough food, and he was willing to share it. That helped build loyalty. People remembered generous leaders. They also remembered selfish ones. And Viking society placed enormous importance on reputation. A person's name could survive for generations. So hosting an impressive feast was not simply about making everyone happy for one evening. It could become part of a leader's reputation. The stories told later might mention his generosity, his wealth, his hospitality, and the number of people he was able to feed. Imagine the scene inside the hall. The harvest has been successful. Fresh food is available. The fires are burning. The tables are full. People are drinking. And someone raises a cup. A toast is made. Perhaps to the gods. Perhaps to the harvest. Perhaps to the ancestors. Perhaps to the people who worked the fields. Everyone drinks. Then, the feast continues. Stories begin. A poet performs. Someone remembers an old ancestor. Another person tells a story about a journey. Children listen from the edges of the room. The evening becomes a celebration of more than food. It becomes a celebration of survival. But harvest festivals could also have an emotional side. The people knew what came next. Winter. The stores were full, but they would eventually become smaller. The animals would need shelter. Travel would become harder. The days would become shorter. So the harvest feast was both an ending and a beginning. The agricultural year was ending, but the winter survival season was beginning. That is why these celebrations could feel so important. The community had reached a turning point. They had produced what they could. Now they had to protect it, store it, and make it last. This required planning. Food had to be preserved. Grain needed to remain dry. Meat needed to be protected. Fish needed to be stored. Dairy products needed suitable preservation. Nothing could simply be wasted. A modern household can throw away food and replace it tomorrow. A Viking household could not. Every piece mattered. A wasted animal, a spoiled batch of grain, or a failed storage method could become a serious problem months later. So when people celebrated a successful harvest, they were celebrating something extremely concrete. They had food. They had survived another year. And they had a chance to make it through the winter. There was also a strong connection between harvest and fertility. The earth had produced. The animals had reproduced. The crops had grown. And the community hoped the cycle would continue. This is where the religious traditions associated with fertility and prosperity become especially meaningful. The gods were not simply characters in stories. They were part of a worldview that helped people understand uncertainty. And during a successful harvest, people had a reason to be grateful. Perhaps the gods had been favourable. Perhaps the rituals had worked. Perhaps luck had been good. Whatever explanation someone believed, the result was the same. There was food on the table, and that was worth celebrating. As the feast continues, the atmosphere becomes warmer. People are no longer thinking about the fields. For one evening, the work can wait. The harvest has been gathered. The animals are secure. The stores are filling, and the community can enjoy itself. But outside, the landscape is changing. Leaves are falling. The temperature is dropping. The nights are growing longer. And the Viking year is moving toward its final major stage. Winter. The same winter that made Yule so important is now approaching again. The cycle is almost complete. Spring became summer. Summer became harvest. Harvest became winter. And eventually, winter would become spring again. This endless cycle shaped Viking life, and the festivals marked its most important turning points. So, as the last harvest feast begins to quiet, imagine the fields outside. They are mostly empty now. The grain has been collected. The animals are sheltered. The food is stored. Smoke rises from the settlement. And inside the hall, people are still talking, still drinking, still telling stories. They know the cold is coming. But tonight, there is enough food, enough warmth, and enough company. For now, that is enough, because soon the doors will close against the winter wind, the fires will burn longer, and the Vikings will enter the darkest season of the year once again. And this time, we are going to look at one of the most fascinating parts of their celebrations, the weddings. Because for the Vikings, a marriage wasn't simply about two people falling in love. It could involve families, property, politics, gifts, feasting, and sometimes a surprisingly complicated negotiation. The harvest is over. The food has been stored. The animals are prepared for winter. And now, another kind of celebration is about to begin. A wedding. For the Vikings, marriage was rarely just a private decision between two people. It could involve entire families, property, social status, political alliances, promises, gifts, and, of course, a very large amount of food. In Viking society, family mattered enormously. Your family could determine who supported you, who inherited your property, who defended you during a dispute, and who stood beside you when things went wrong. So marriage could strengthen those connections. Imagine two families preparing for a wedding. This isn't simply a matter of deciding where everyone will sit. There may be discussions about wealth, property, gifts, and responsibilities. The agreement between families could be more important than the romantic feelings of the couple themselves. That doesn't mean love didn't exist. Of course it did. People formed emotional attachments. But marriage also had practical consequences. When two people married, their families became connected, and those connections could last for generations. That made a wedding an important social event. And naturally, important social events required food. Lots of it. A wedding feast could be one of the biggest celebrations a household ever hosted. Guests could travel from considerable distances. Relatives would arrive, friends would come, important community members would be invited, and everyone had to be fed. So once again, the Viking hall became the centre of the community. The fire was burning, the tables were prepared, drink was available, and people gathered to celebrate the new marriage. But before the feast, there were other traditions. The marriage itself could involve formal agreements and rituals. Our knowledge comes from later written sources and other evidence, so the exact customs could vary considerably. But one thing is clear. Marriage was not treated casually. It could involve legal and economic arrangements. Property mattered. Dowries and other forms of wealth could be part of the agreement, and gifts could be exchanged between families. These weren't simply decorative presents. They could have real economic value. Livestock, clothing, weapons, jewelry, household goods, land or other property, depending on the circumstances. A marriage could therefore affect the economic position of both families, and that made weddings important enough to involve the wider community. Now, imagine the guests arriving. Some have travelled for hours, others perhaps for days. The settlement begins filling with people. The bride and groom are dressed carefully. Jewellery may be worn. Fine clothing is brought out. People who normally live very ordinary lives suddenly have a reason to look their best. The atmosphere is different. Excitement, nervousness, curiosity, and probably a lot of gossip. Because wherever people gather, people talk. Who is marrying whom? Why this family? How wealthy are they? What gifts were exchanged? Who was invited? Who wasn't? And perhaps most importantly, how much food is going to be served? The wedding feast itself could reinforce the importance of the marriage. The more impressive the feast, the more clearly the families could demonstrate their wealth and generosity. A powerful family could host an enormous celebration. A poorer family might have a much simpler one, but the basic principle remained. The community gathered to witness the new relationship. Food was shared, drink was offered, and the marriage became a public event. This public nature mattered. Marriage created obligations. If the relationship later produced children, those children belonged to both family networks. Property could pass between generations, and alliances could be strengthened. So everyone had an interest in the marriage succeeding. And then there were gifts. Gift-giving was deeply embedded in Viking society. A gift could communicate affection, respect, loyalty, or obligation. At a wedding, gifts could have particular importance. The exchange could demonstrate that both sides were entering the relationship seriously. And the gifts could also provide practical resources for the newly married couple. A new household needed things: clothing, tools, animals, food, household equipment, perhaps weapons, perhaps jewellery. Marriage could therefore be the beginning of an entirely new household economy. The couple had to establish their life together, and that required resources. Then came the feast. Imagine the room again. Meat is being served. Bread is passed around. Fish may be available. Porridge, cheese, butter, and other local foods. Drink is flowing. People are talking. The newly married couple is surrounded by family. Someone raises a cup. A toast is made. Everyone drinks. Then another toast. And another. The celebration continues. But Viking weddings could also carry religious significance. Marriage was connected to fertility, family, and the continuation of the community. The desire for children and a successful household was extremely important. That meant fertility traditions could naturally become part of wedding celebrations. Again, we shouldn't imagine that every Viking wedding followed one identical ritual. The evidence is too incomplete for that. But fertility was certainly an important concern within Viking society. A successful marriage wasn't simply about companionship. It was about creating a functioning household. And potentially, the next generation. That generation would inherit the family's name, property, stories, traditions, and responsibilities. So when a wedding took place, people were not only celebrating two individuals, they were celebrating the continuation of a family. And that brings us back to one of the most important themes of Viking festivals: community. A wedding gathered people together. A harvest gathered people together. Yule gathered people together. Religious ceremonies gathered people together. Again and again, the Vikings created occasions where people could meet, and those meetings helped hold society together. But weddings could also reveal social differences. Not everyone at the feast had the same status. The most important guests might receive special treatment. The families of the bride and groom had particular importance. Powerful individuals could use the occasion to display wealth, and the placement of people in the hall could communicate social hierarchy. So even during celebration, everyone knew that society had levels. Some people had more wealth, more influence, more land, more followers, and more authority. A wedding didn't erase those differences. It displayed them, sometimes very clearly. And then there was the drinking. By now, we know the pattern. Food, drink, toasts, stories, and eventually, someone probably drinks more than they intended. A wedding feast could continue for hours, perhaps even longer, and when enough people were drinking, things could become unpredictable. Someone could become emotional. Someone could start an argument. Someone could tell a story that should probably have remained private. And someone, almost certainly, would eventually say something embarrassing. Viking society was not immune to ordinary human behaviour, but the stories told about weddings could become part of family memory. Years later, people might still remember the feast, the guests, the gifts, the speeches, the arguments, and the embarrassing moments. The wedding, therefore, became part of the family's history. And that was important. Vikings valued reputation. A person's story could continue long after their death. The same was true for families. Their ancestors mattered, their accomplishments mattered, and their relationships mattered. A successful marriage could strengthen the family's future. A disastrous marriage could create conflict. So marriage was serious. But the celebration didn't have to be. For one evening, people could eat, drink, laugh, listen to stories, and enjoy themselves. The work could wait until tomorrow. The winter preparations could wait a little longer. Tonight, there was a wedding, and somewhere in the hall, the newly married couple was probably wondering exactly how long this feast was going to continue, because the Vikings had another tradition that could make celebrations considerably more complicated: the exchange of gifts. And in Viking society, a gift was rarely just a gift. Sometimes it created an obligation. Sometimes it strengthened an alliance. And sometimes it quietly told everyone in the room exactly how powerful you were. So as the wedding feast continues, the gifts begin appearing, and the social game of generosity is about to begin. The wedding feast is still going. The food has been served. The drink continues to circulate. The newly married couple sits among their families. And now, something important begins. The gifts. In the modern world, a gift can be simple. Someone gives you a birthday present. You say thank you. You open it. And perhaps you use it. The relationship continues exactly as before. But in Viking society, gift giving could carry much more weight. A valuable gift could create an obligation. It could demonstrate loyalty. It could strengthen friendship. It could reward service. It could establish an alliance. Or it could remind everyone in the room exactly who had the power to give. That made gifts an important part of Viking social life. Imagine a powerful chieftain standing in the hall. He has already provided the feast. Everyone has eaten. Everyone has drunk. And now, he presents a valuable object to someone. Perhaps a weapon. Perhaps jewellery. Perhaps fine clothing. perhaps something obtained through trade or travel. The recipient accepts it, and everyone watches, because the important question isn't only, what was given? It is also, why was it given? And what will happen afterward? A gift could create a relationship between two people. If a leader gave a warrior a valuable weapon, that warrior might feel a stronger obligation toward his leader. If someone gave a friend a valuable object, the friend might eventually be expected to return the generosity. If one family gave another family important wedding gifts, the exchange could strengthen the marriage alliance. The gift moved from one hand to another, but the relationship moved with it. This was particularly important because Viking society relied heavily on personal loyalty. A ruler needed supporters, a warrior needed allies, a family needed relatives, a traveller needed hosts, and everyone benefited from having people who would remember their generosity. A gift helped create that memory. You gave something, and the recipient remembered you. Perhaps years later, they would return the favour. Or perhaps they would tell others about your generosity. Either way, your reputation grew, and reputation was incredibly valuable. A person could possess wealth, but if everyone thought they were selfish, that wealth didn't automatically make them respected. Generosity could transform wealth into reputation. The more powerful the person, the more important this could become. A wealthy chieftain who constantly gave gifts could attract followers. People wanted to be associated with someone generous. They wanted to receive his protection. They wanted access to his hall. They wanted to fight alongside him. They wanted to be part of his network. So gift-giving could help build political power. This is one reason Viking leaders hosted enormous feasts. The feast itself demonstrated wealth, but the gifts afterward could reinforce the message. I have enough to give away. I have enough resources to reward my followers, and I expect loyalty in return. It was almost a social economy, not based only on coins, but on relationships. And that system could be extremely powerful. A warrior who received a valuable weapon from his leader might feel personally connected to him. The weapon itself could become a symbol of that relationship. Every time he carried it, he remembered who had given it to him. And if he later performed something impressive, the gift might become part of the story. Imagine a warrior returning from a successful voyage. People ask about the journey. He tells them about the battles, the storms, the distant lands, and perhaps someone remembers the sword he carries. Wasn't that the sword your lord gave you? Yes. The object has become part of his identity. This is why valuable objects mattered so much. Weapons, jewellery, clothing, fine metalwork, and imported goods could all carry social meaning. They weren't simply possessions. They could represent relationships. And some objects were especially impressive because they had travelled a long way. The Viking world was connected to enormous trading networks. Goods could move across the Baltic, the North Sea, the Atlantic, and deep into Europe and beyond. Silver was especially important. Coins from distant regions have been found across Scandinavia, and silver could be valued not only as money, but as a material that demonstrated access to trade and wealth. Imagine receiving a piece of silver from someone powerful. It didn't necessarily come from a nearby farm. It may have travelled hundreds or even thousands of kilometres. The object therefore carried a story, and the person giving it was demonstrating something. Connections, wealth, access, and status. But gift-giving could become complicated, because once a gift was given, the recipient could feel pressure to respond. If you receive something valuable and give nothing in return, what does that say? Perhaps you are ungrateful. Perhaps you are weak. Perhaps you are refusing the relationship. So gifts could create expectations, and expectations could create tension. Imagine two powerful families. One gives the other a valuable gift. The receiving family accepts it. Now, what do they give back? If their response is too small, they may appear disrespectful. If they give too much, perhaps they weaken their own position. The exchange itself becomes a negotiation. This is why Viking gift-giving could be closely connected with politics. A gift could communicate friendship, without requiring a written contract. It could communicate respect without a formal declaration, and it could create obligation without anyone saying the word. That made it remarkably useful. The same principle could appear in marriage. A wedding wasn't simply the joining of two individuals, it connected families. So gifts could help establish the economic relationship between those families. The objects exchanged might become part of the new household. They could provide practical resources or display the wealth of the families involved, and everyone attending the feast could see the exchange. Again, the public nature mattered. A private gift could strengthen one relationship. A public gift could strengthen a reputation. Imagine a chieftain giving a magnificent object to a respected warrior in front of everyone. The entire hall sees it. The warrior receives the honor. The chieftain receives the reputation for generosity, and everyone else receives a message. This is the kind of leader I am. It is a simple social performance, but an extremely effective one. And then, there were gifts between friends. Not every gift was political. People could give gifts because they genuinely cared about each other. Friendship mattered. Family mattered. Hospitality mattered. And generosity was a way to express those relationships. But even then, reciprocity could remain important. You helped me. I help you. You give me something. I give you something. You host me. I host you. The relationship grows through repeated exchanges. It becomes a pattern, and patterns become traditions. This is why Viking society could place such emphasis on generosity. A community wasn't held together only by laws. It was also held together by relationships. People remembered favors. They remembered insults. They remembered gifts. And they remembered debts. That last part could be especially important, because not every gift created a pleasant obligation. Sometimes, a gift could become a burden. Imagine accepting something valuable from a powerful person. You are grateful. But now, you owe them. Perhaps they ask for your support later. Perhaps they expect you to join them on a journey. Perhaps they expect your family to support theirs. The gift has become a form of social leverage. And that is why a Viking might think carefully before accepting generosity. A gift could be wonderful, but it could also come with strings attached. The Vikings understood this. Their stories repeatedly explore generosity, obligation, loyalty, and betrayal. The same themes appear again and again. Who gave what? Who returned the favor? Who broke their promise? Who remained loyal? Who became an enemy? These weren't just entertaining stories. They reflected a society where they would return the favor. Or perhaps they would tell others about your generosity. Either way, your reputation grew, and reputation was incredibly valuable. A person could possess wealth, but if everyone thought they were selfish, that wealth didn't automatically make them respected. Generosity could transform wealth into reputation. The more powerful the person, the more important this could become. A wealthy chieftain who constantly gave gifts could attract followers. People wanted to be associated with someone generous. They wanted to receive his protection. They wanted access to his hall. They wanted to fight alongside him. They wanted to be part of his network. So gift-giving could help build political power. This is one reason Viking leaders hosted enormous feasts. The feast itself demonstrated wealth, but the gifts afterward could reinforce the message. I have enough to give away. I have enough resources to reward my followers, and I expect loyalty in return. It was almost a social economy, not based only on coins, but on relationships. And that system could be extremely powerful. A warrior who received a valuable weapon from his leader might feel personally connected to him. The weapon itself could become a symbol of that relationship. Every time he carried it, he remembered who had given it to him. And if he later performed something impressive, the gift might become part of the story. Imagine a warrior returning from a successful voyage. People ask about the journey. He tells them about the battles, the storms, the distant lands. And perhaps someone remembers the sword he carries. Wasn't that the sword your lord gave you? Yes. The object has become part of his identity. This is why valuable objects mattered so much. Weapons, jewelry, clothing, fine metalwork, and imported goods could all carry social meaning. They weren't simply possessions. They could represent relationships. And some objects were especially impressive because they had travelled a long way. The Viking world was connected to enormous trading networks. Goods could move across the Baltic, the North Sea, the Atlantic, and deep into Europe and beyond. Silver was especially important. Coins from distant regions have been found across Scandinavia, and silver could be valued not only as money, but as a material that demonstrated access to trade and wealth. Imagine receiving a piece of silver from someone powerful. It didn't necessarily come from a nearby farm. It may have travelled hundreds or even thousands of kilometres. The object therefore carried a story, and the person giving it was demonstrating something. Connections, wealth, access, and status. But gift giving could become complicated, because once a gift was given, the recipient could feel pressure to respond. If you receive something valuable and give nothing in return, what does that say? Perhaps you are ungrateful. Perhaps you are weak. Perhaps you are refusing the relationship. So gifts could create expectations, and expectations could create tension. Imagine two powerful families. One gives the other a valuable gift. The receiving family accepts it. Now, what do they give back? If their response is too small, they may appear disrespectful. If they give too much, perhaps they weaken their own position. The exchange itself becomes a negotiation. This is why Viking gift-giving could be closely connected with politics. A gift could communicate friendship without requiring a written contract. It could communicate respect without a formal declaration. And it could create obligation without anyone saying the word. That made it remarkably useful. The same principle could appear in marriage. A wedding wasn't simply the joining of two individuals. It connected families. So gifts could help establish the economic relationship between those families. The objects exchanged might become part of the new household. They could provide practical resources or display the wealth of the families involved, and everyone attending the feast could see the exchange. Again, the public nature mattered. A private gift could strengthen one relationship. A public gift could strengthen a reputation. Imagine a chieftain giving a magnificent object to a respected warrior in front of everyone. The entire hall sees it. The warrior receives the honour. The chieftain receives the reputation for generosity. And everyone else receives a message. This is the kind of leader I am. It is a simple social performance, but an extremely effective one. And then, there were gifts between friends. Not every gift was political. People could give gifts because they genuinely cared about each other. Friendship mattered, family mattered, hospitality mattered, and generosity was a way to express those relationships. But even then, reciprocity could remain important. You helped me. I help you. You give me something. I give you something. You host me. I host you. The relationship grows through repeated exchanges. It becomes a pattern, and patterns become traditions. This is why Viking society could place such emphasis on generosity. A community wasn't held together only by laws. It was also held together by relationships. People remembered favours. They remembered insults. They remembered gifts. And they remembered debts. That last part could be especially important, because not every gift created a pleasant obligation. Sometimes, a gift could become a burden. Imagine accepting something valuable from a powerful person. You are grateful. But now, you owe them. Perhaps they ask for your support later. Perhaps they expect you to join them on a journey. Perhaps they expect your family to support theirs. The gift has become a form of social leverage, and that is why a Viking might think carefully before accepting generosity. A gift could be wonderful, but it could also come with strings attached. The Vikings understood this. Their stories repeatedly explore generosity, obligation, loyalty, and betrayal. The same themes appear again and again. Who gave what? Who returned the favour? Who broke their promise? Who remained loyal? Who became an enemy? These weren't just entertaining stories. They reflected a society where personal relationships mattered enormously, and nowhere was this more visible than during a great festival. People gathered together. They ate. They drank. They exchanged gifts. They made promises. And they remembered everything. By the end of the celebration, the food would be gone. The drink would be finished. The fires would eventually burn low. But the relationships created during the feast could last for years, perhaps decades, sometimes generations. And there was one more important thing that made these gatherings so powerful. People didn't only exchange objects, they exchanged stories. Stories about ancestors, stories about heroes, stories about gods, stories about enemies, and stories about the people sitting inside the hall. Because in Viking society, a good story could be almost as valuable as a good gift, and some people were exceptionally skilled at telling them. Poets, storytellers, and skalds. In the next chapter, we'll enter their world, because when the food disappeared and the drinking began to slow, the hall didn't become quiet. It became a stage, and someone was about to tell a story that everyone would remember. The feast is beginning to quiet down. The food has been eaten. The cups are still being passed around. But now, something else takes over the hall. Words. A person stands before the gathering. Perhaps everyone already knows who they are. Perhaps they have travelled a long distance to be here. They are a skald, a poet, a storyteller. And in Viking society, that could be a very powerful person to have in the room. Because before newspapers, before radio, before television, before recordings, there was memory. And memory depended on people who could turn events into stories. The skalds were specialists in that art. They composed poetry. They praised rulers. They remembered battles. They described journeys. They mocked enemies. They celebrated heroes. And sometimes they could insult someone so cleverly that the insult survived for generations. A powerful warrior could die. A wealthy chieftain could disappear. A kingdom could collapse. But a poem could remain. That made poetry more than entertainment. It could preserve reputation. Imagine a Viking leader sitting in his hall. He has wealth, ships, warriors, land, followers. He has spent years building his reputation. But what happens after he dies? Without someone to remember him, his achievements could eventually disappear. A skilled poet could change that. A poem could tell everyone who he was, where he fought, who he defeated, who supported him, what gifts he gave, and what kind of man he was. The words could travel from one hall to another, from one generation to the next. And eventually, the leader could become part of history. This is why rulers valued poets. A skilled skald could be rewarded handsomely. A powerful patron could provide gifts, food, shelter, and protection. In return, the poet provided something extremely valuable: fame. And fame mattered, perhaps more than almost anything. The Vikings lived in a culture where reputation was constantly being created. People talked about each other. They remembered actions. They remembered courage. They remembered generosity. And they remembered cowardice. A person's reputation could influence how others treated them. So imagine what happened when a famous poet entered the hall. Everyone knew this person could make your name famous, or, potentially, make you look ridiculous. That gave poets a strange kind of power. They didn't need to carry a sword. Their weapon was language, and some Viking poetry was incredibly complex. Skaldic poetry could use elaborate structures, wordplay, metaphors, and tightly controlled patterns. A skilled poet had to remember a tremendous amount of material. This wasn't casual storytelling. It was a specialized craft, and the audience could recognize skill. Imagine sitting in the hall, listening to someone describe a battle. The poet doesn't simply say, "Then they fought." Instead, the language becomes dramatic. Ships become sea beasts. Weapons become storms. Warriors become something greater than ordinary men. The battle becomes almost mythological. The audience listens, and suddenly, a real event becomes a legend. That is the power of storytelling, and it explains why Viking festivals were such good environments for poets. Everyone was already gathered. The hall was warm. People had been eating and drinking. The mood was relaxed, and there was an audience. A poet could perform. People could listen. And the story could become part of the collective memory. But not every story had to be serious. Viking humour could be sharp, very sharp. Poetry could be used to mock someone. Insults could be turned into art. And clever verbal attacks could become legendary. This is particularly interesting because the Viking world is often portrayed as endlessly serious. Warriors, axes, ships, battles. But people still laughed. They made jokes. They teased each other. They told embarrassing stories, and they mocked their enemies. A feast was a perfect place for this. Imagine someone standing up after several cups of drink and deciding to make a joke about another guest. The room goes quiet. Everyone looks at the target. The poet delivers the line. And suddenly, the entire hall erupts in laughter. Except, perhaps, the person being mocked. Because Viking humour could have consequences. Words could start arguments. An insult could become a feud. And a feud could become much more serious. This is another reason reputation mattered so much. If someone publicly humiliated you, ignoring it could make you appear weak. Responding could create conflict. So even a joke could carry weight. The boundary between entertainment and danger was sometimes surprisingly thin. But most storytelling wasn't about starting fights. It was about remembering. And perhaps the most important stories were those about ancestors. Viking families cared deeply about lineage. Who were your parents? Who were your grandparents? Which famous people were part of your family? Where did your ancestors come from? These questions mattered. A person wasn't simply an individual. They belonged to a family history. And storytelling kept that history alive. Imagine an old man telling children about their great-grandfather. The children may never have met him, but through the story, he becomes real. They learn what he did, how he behaved, what kind of person he was, and perhaps they are told that they should live up to his example. This is how culture survives, not through abstract documents, but through people telling stories to other people. The festival hall became one of those places. The children listened, the adults remembered, the poet performed, and the past remained alive. But stories weren't only about the past. They could also explain the world. Myths about gods, giants, monsters, magic, and heroic journeys could provide ways of understanding things people couldn't explain. Why does thunder happen? What lives beyond the human world? Why do people die? What happens after death? Why do certain families succeed? Why do others fail? Mythology gave people stories through which these questions could be explored, and festivals provided the perfect environment for telling them. Imagine the hall late at night. The fire has become smaller. The children are sleepy. Most of the food has disappeared. The adults are still drinking. And the storyteller begins. The story is about Odin. Then Thor appears. Then a giant. Then a dangerous journey. The audience knows some of these characters. They have heard their names before. But tonight, the story feels new. Because storytelling is never exactly the same twice. The storyteller's voice changes. The audience reacts differently. Someone laughs. Someone interrupts. Someone adds a detail. Someone remembers another version. The story evolves. And that is how oral traditions survive. They change, but they also remain recognizable. Generation after generation, people keep telling them. And eventually, some of those stories would be written down. Long after the Viking Age, Christian Icelandic writers recorded many of the myths and stories we know today. Those written sources are invaluable. But they also remind us that what survives is not a perfect recording of Viking life. It is the result of centuries of transmission. So when we read a saga today, we're seeing the past through layers of memory. Still, the stories preserve something extraordinary. A glimpse into how people imagined their world, how they understood courage, honor, family, fate, love, betrayal, and death. And all of those ideas could appear in a single evening of storytelling. The feast, therefore, becomes almost like a classroom. But nobody thinks they're attending school. They're eating, drinking, laughing, listening, and learning. The children learn the stories. The young learn the traditions. The guests learn about each other. And everyone leaves with new information. Perhaps that is one reason festivals were so important. They created spaces where knowledge could move, not through books, but through people. The skald finishes the poem. The hall becomes quiet for a moment. Then, someone raises a cup. The audience responds, and the celebration continues. But there is one more kind of performer who could make these gatherings memorable. Someone who didn't necessarily need a complicated poem. Someone who could create energy with movement, sound, and music. Because Viking festivals weren't silent storytelling sessions. They could also involve performance, songs, instruments, rhythm, and dancing. And once the storyteller sits down, the musicians are ready, the fire grows brighter, people move closer together, and the next part of the celebration begins. The skald has finished. For a moment, the hall is quiet. Then someone begins to play. A rhythm fills the room. The mood changes almost immediately. The serious story about gods and ancestors fades into the background. People begin talking again. Someone starts keeping time. And before long, the festival has become louder, more energetic, more chaotic. Because Viking celebrations were not simply about sitting quietly around a fire. Music and performance could be part of communal gatherings. We don't know exactly what every Viking festival sounded like. That is one of the frustrating things about studying ancient music. Unlike a sword, a piece of jewelry, or a cooking vessel, sound doesn't survive in the ground. We can discover instruments. We can find archaeological evidence. We can read descriptions in later sources. But we cannot press a button and hear a Viking musician performing a song exactly as they would have done 1,000 years ago. So when modern films create a Viking soundtrack, they are imagining. Some of the instruments they use may be inspired by historical examples, but the actual sound of a Viking festival remains partly lost. Still, we know that instruments existed. Horns, flutes, stringed instruments, drums or percussion, and other forms of sound-making objects have been found or described. One of the most recognizable possibilities would have been the horn. Animal horns could be used as musical or signaling instruments, but not every horn was necessarily a drinking vessel. That is an important distinction. Modern popular culture loves the image of a Viking warrior drinking from a huge horn. But horns had other possible functions. They could produce sound. They could signal. And they could be used in different contexts. Imagine hearing a horn across a settlement. Its sound carries farther than a human voice. People turn their heads. Someone has arrived. Or perhaps the gathering is beginning. Sound itself could become part of the event. Then there were stringed instruments. These could provide melodies for songs and performances. A musician might accompany a singer. A storyteller might use music to enhance a performance. And the combination of voice and instrument could make a story much more memorable. Think about how powerful music is even today. A melody can make us remember something. It can change our mood. It can make a celebration feel exciting. And it can make a sad story feel even more emotional. The Vikings understood this basic human reaction. Even if they had completely different instruments, music could turn words into an experience. And festivals were perfect places for that experience. The community was already gathered. Everyone had eaten. People were relaxed. And there was time for entertainment. So someone begins playing. Perhaps people sing. Perhaps others join in. And eventually, people begin moving. Dancing is difficult to reconstruct in detail. We don't have complete descriptions of Viking dance traditions. But movement and communal performance certainly existed in the wider cultural world. And it is difficult to imagine large celebrations involving music. without some kind of physical response. People clap, move, stamp their feet, turn in circles, or simply sway with the rhythm. Again, we should be careful about pretending to know exactly what happened, but we can understand the basic human instinct. Music begins, people react, the atmosphere changes, and suddenly, a quiet hall becomes a celebration. Children would probably have loved this part. They didn't need to understand complicated religious rituals. They didn't need to remember every family connection. They could simply enjoy the noise, the movement, the music, and the excitement. And perhaps the adults enjoyed it just as much. Festivals provided a break from ordinary routines. Work could be exhausting. Farming was physically demanding. Fishing was dangerous. Travel was difficult. And winter could be brutal. A celebration gave people permission to relax. For a few hours, the normal rules of everyday life became less important. People could laugh, sing, dance, drink, and tell stories. This was particularly important because Viking society could be socially demanding. Everyone had responsibilities. You couldn't simply disappear from the community. Your family depended on you. Your animals depended on you. Your household depended on you. So moments of collective celebration mattered. Everyone could release some of that pressure together. But music wasn't only entertainment. It could also have ceremonial functions. Certain sounds could mark important moments. A horn might signal the beginning of something. A song could accompany a ritual. A performance could preserve a story. And poetry itself had a musical quality. The boundary between music and storytelling wasn't always as clear as it is today. A skald could perform poetry, and the performance itself could involve rhythm, sound, and vocal emphasis. So the hall might move seamlessly from story to song, to music, to dance. One performance leads into another, and nobody needs to announce, "Now we will begin the entertainment portion of the evening." The entertainment simply happens. That spontaneity is part of what makes a festival feel alive. And perhaps the most interesting thing about this is that people weren't merely watching. They were participating. Modern entertainment often separates performers from audiences. One group performs, the other watches. But communal celebrations can be different. People sing along, dance together, respond to jokes, shout, drink, and interrupt. The audience becomes part of the performance. A Viking festival could have worked in much the same way. Someone begins a song, others join. Someone tells a story. Another person adds a detail. A joke is made. The room responds. The celebration becomes a shared creation, and that shared experience strengthens community. You aren't simply sitting beside your neighbours, you're celebrating with them. That distinction matters, because Viking society depended heavily on social relationships. You needed people for protection, trade, work, family, travel, and political support. Festivals created opportunities to maintain those relationships. Even something as simple as dancing together could help. People who laugh together remember the experience. People who share a meal feel connected. People who celebrate together create memories, and memories become part of community identity. There was also another kind of performance that could appear in the Viking world: sport and competition. Because if you gathered a large group of Vikings together, someone was eventually going to start competing. Strength, skill, speed, endurance, and sometimes a questionable amount of confidence. Games and contests could be part of social life, and festivals were ideal opportunities. There were spectators, there was free time, there was excitement, and there were plenty of people willing to prove that they were stronger or better than their neighbours. A friendly competition could begin, but as with everything else, things could become serious. Because reputation was involved. If you won, people remembered. If you lost spectacularly, people remembered that too. And sometimes, the difference between friendly competition and wounded pride could be very small. Still, the basic purpose remained the same. People were together. They were doing something, and they were enjoying themselves. The festival was becoming a complete social experience. Food, drink, religion, stories, music, performance, competition, and friendship. Almost every part of Viking life could appear inside the same gathering. And as the night continued, the noise would eventually become louder. People would talk over one another. The musicians would keep playing. The dancers would keep moving. And the fires would burn. But eventually, every celebration reaches a point where people become tired. The musicians slow down. The stories become quieter. Some guests begin leaving. Others find places to sleep. And the great festival gradually comes to an end. But before we leave the celebration behind, there is another part of Viking social life we need to understand. Because not everyone came to these gatherings simply to celebrate. Some people came to compete. Some came to negotiate. Some came to find marriage partners. And some came to prove themselves. The Viking world valued courage and strength, and festivals provided opportunities to display both. So in the next chapter, we'll leave the music behind for a moment. The crowd is gathering outside. People are making space. Someone has just announced a contest. And now, everyone wants to see who is strong enough to win. The music is still echoing through the settlement. People are laughing. The fires are burning. And then, someone steps into the open space outside the hall. The crowd begins to move closer. Because now, the celebration is becoming a competition. For the Vikings, physical ability mattered, strength mattered, endurance mattered, agility mattered, and reputation mattered. A festival was therefore an ideal place to demonstrate what you could do. There was an audience, there were rivals, and there was something very valuable waiting for the winner: respect. We should be careful about imagining one universal Viking sporting program. Different communities had different traditions. The surviving sources also come from different periods, but games, athletic contests, and forms of physical competition are clearly represented in the wider Norse cultural tradition. And some of them could be surprisingly intense. One famous type of contest involved wrestling. Two people would face one another, grab hold, and try to overpower the other. It sounds simple, but wrestling requires technique, balance, strength, timing, and endurance. You don't simply need to be strong. You need to know how to use your strength. A smaller person with better technique could potentially defeat someone much larger. And that made wrestling interesting to watch. The crowd would gather around. People would shout encouragement. Friends would cheer. Rivals would watch closely. And the two competitors would struggle for position. One grabs. The other twists away. Someone loses balance. The crowd reacts. Then, the fight continues. There is no elaborate stadium, no electronic scoreboard, no professional referee standing under bright lights, just people watching two competitors try to prove themselves. And because reputation mattered, winning could mean more than entertainment. A strong competitor could gain respect. Perhaps people would remember the victory. Perhaps it would become part of his reputation. And perhaps he would be challenged again at the next gathering. But wrestling wasn't the only possible competition. Strength could also be demonstrated through lifting or carrying heavy objects. The famous Icelandic tradition of lifting stones is associated with later periods, so we should not simply claim that every Viking festival included a stone lifting contest. But the broader cultural admiration for physical strength is clear. The idea was straightforward. Can you lift it? Can you carry it? Can you endure? These questions mattered in a society where physical labor was part of everyday life. Farmers needed strength. Sailors needed strength. Warriors needed strength. Even ordinary household work could be physically demanding. So athletic ability wasn't completely separate from practical life. The skills displayed during competition could have real value. Then there were swimming contests. This might sound surprising, but in a society surrounded by water, swimming was a useful skill. The Vikings were seafarers. They travelled across rivers, lakes, fjords, and open seas. Knowing how to survive in water could be valuable. Again, we don't know exactly how frequently organised swimming competitions took place. but swimming appears in Old Norse literature as a recognized form of physical skill. And that tells us something important. Water wasn't only an obstacle. It was part of the environment. People lived beside it, travelled across it, fished in it, and sometimes fell into it. So knowing how to handle yourself in water could save your life. Some contests could also involve weapons. This is where things become more complicated. The Vikings were certainly familiar with weapons training, but a festival contest wasn't necessarily a real battle. Different traditions could involve controlled demonstrations of skill, and the surviving evidence does not allow us to reconstruct one standard Viking combat tournament. Popular movies often show Vikings fighting in enormous arenas, but real life was more varied. Some competitions were probably much simpler: a demonstration of skill, a test of strength, a friendly rivalry, or a challenge between individuals. And sometimes a contest could have serious consequences, because Vikings had something modern competitive athletes also have: pride. Imagine two strong men standing in front of a crowd. One wins, the other loses. Everyone sees it. The loser might laugh. He might congratulate the winner. Or he might not be very happy about it. If honor or reputation was involved, a public defeat could sting. And Viking literature is filled with examples of conflicts arising from insults, challenges, and wounded pride. So a friendly competition could sometimes become something less friendly. This is one reason the atmosphere at festivals could be unpredictable. People were eating, drinking, celebrating, competing, and interacting with people from different families. Most of the time, that probably created friendships. But sometimes, it created arguments. And sometimes arguments became feuds. The Viking concept of honor is important here. Honor wasn't simply about being morally perfect. It was about reputation, how others viewed you, whether you were courageous, whether you kept your promises, whether you defended yourself, whether you were generous, and whether people respected you. Public events were therefore important. If everyone watched you win, your reputation could grow. If everyone watched you fail, they might remember that too. And that is why competitions could matter. They were public demonstrations of ability. But there was another reason festivals were perfect for games. People had time. During ordinary working days, there wasn't always an opportunity to spend hours competing. A farmer had work, a sailor had work, a craftsman had work. But during a festival, the community had gathered specifically for celebration, so people could play. And play was valuable. Children could participate in games. Young people could compete. Adults could demonstrate their skills. And older people could watch, judge, and tell stories about how things were done in their youth. This created another connection between generations. The young wanted to prove themselves. The older generation wanted to see whether they had what it took. And inevitably, someone would say, "Things were different when I was young," because apparently, people have been saying that for thousands of years. Games also gave young people opportunities to meet one another. A festival could bring together families from different settlements. Young men and women could see each other, talk, compete, dance, and perhaps begin relationships. This connects back to marriage. Festivals weren't simply religious gatherings. They were social marketplaces of a kind. Not necessarily a literal market, but a place where people could observe one another. Who was wealthy? Who was respected? Who was strong? Who was generous? Who was attractive? Who had a good family? Who was reliable? All of these things could influence social relationships, and because everyone was gathered together, information travelled quickly. A young person might become known beyond their own settlement. A skilled competitor could attract attention. A wealthy family could demonstrate its status, and a powerful leader could build new alliances. So the games were only one part of a much larger social system. The crowd watches. The competition ends. Someone wins. Someone loses. People laugh. Someone begins telling the story immediately. And before long, the competition becomes part of the festival's memory. Years later, someone might still say, Do you remember when he defeated that champion? The details might become exaggerated, the story might become funnier, the winner might become more impressive with every retelling, and eventually, a simple competition could become a legend. That is another example of how Viking culture transformed ordinary events into stories. A feast becomes a memory, a wedding becomes a family tradition, a battle becomes a saga, a competition becomes a tale of strength, and a festival becomes part of the identity of an entire community. But eventually, the games end. The crowd begins to disperse. The musicians start playing again. People return to the hall. The sun is beginning to disappear, and the celebration moves toward its final hours. The cups are still being passed. The fire is burning lower, and some people are already tired. But there is one final part of Viking festivals we haven't explored. The moment when everyone goes home. Because a festival wasn't only about gathering, it was also about returning to ordinary life. And when the Vikings left the feast, they didn't simply forget what happened. They carried the memories, the gifts, the promises, the stories, and the relationships back with them. The festival was over, but its consequences were only beginning. The competition is over. The music is quieter now. The fires have burned lower. Some people are still talking inside the hall, while others have already begun preparing to leave. The great celebration is ending. But for the Vikings, the festival wasn't really finished. Not yet. Because everyone was about to take something home. Not necessarily food. Not necessarily gifts. Something less visible. Memory. A festival could last a day, perhaps several days. But the relationships created there could last much longer. A family might return home with a new alliance. A young person might return with a new friendship. A warrior might return carrying a gift from a powerful leader. A merchant might return with a new business connection. And someone, perhaps, would return home with a new marriage arrangement. This was one of the hidden purposes of large gatherings. They brought people together who otherwise might rarely meet. And once everyone returned to their farms and settlements, the stories would travel with them. Imagine a family beginning the journey home. The children are tired. The adults are tired. Someone is carrying food. Someone is carrying a new piece of clothing. Someone has a valuable object received during the celebration. And everyone is talking about what happened. Did you see that competition? Did you hear the poet? Did you meet those people from the other settlement? Did you see how much silver they had? Did you hear who is getting married? The festival is over, but the conversation continues. This is how information travelled. People carried news from one settlement to another. A person who had attended the gathering could become the source of stories for everyone back home. And those stories could spread even farther. One settlement tells another. Another tells a third. Eventually, something that happened at one festival could become known across a much larger region. In a world without instant communication, that was powerful. Festivals were information networks. They were social networks. They were economic networks. And they were religious gatherings, all at the same time. But perhaps the most important thing people carried home was a stronger sense of belonging. You had seen your relatives. You had honoured the gods. You had honoured the gods. You had eaten together. You had celebrated. You had watched competitions. You had listened to stories. And now, you were returning to ordinary life. That shared experience mattered, because ordinary life could be difficult. The farm still needed work. The animals still needed feeding. The weather could still change. Winter could still arrive. And conflicts could still happen. But now, you had people you knew. People you trusted. People who had shared the same celebration. That made the community stronger. And the Viking world depended on strong communities. A person rarely survived entirely alone. You needed family. You needed allies. You needed neighbours. You needed people who would help when something went wrong. A festival helped maintain those connections. Think about how often people today maintain friendships through gatherings. A wedding, a family reunion, a holiday dinner, a community celebration. The Viking version was different. But the underlying human purpose was surprisingly familiar. People wanted to see one another, eat together, talk, laugh, and remember that they belonged to something larger than themselves. But there was another thing the Vikings carried home: obligations. A gift had been received, a promise had been made, a marriage had been arranged, a political alliance had been discussed, a favour had been requested. The festival could create responsibilities. And now, those responsibilities had to be fulfilled. This is one reason Viking society could not be separated neatly into religion, politics, family, and economics. Everything overlapped. A religious feast could create political relationships. A wedding could change property arrangements. A gift could create an obligation. A story could strengthen someone's reputation. A competition could create a rivalry. And a single gathering could contain all of these things at once. That complexity is what makes Viking festivals so fascinating. They weren't simply parties. They were social machinery. They helped keep communities functioning. And once the celebration ended, the machinery kept moving. The travellers returned home. The merchants continued their journeys. The farmers returned to their fields. The warriors returned to their households. The newly married couple began their life together, and the stories continued. Perhaps the poet had performed a great story about a famous ancestor. Now someone else would repeat it. Perhaps a child had heard the story for the first time. Years later, that child might tell it to their own children, and another generation would remember. That is how oral culture survives. The festival creates the audience carries the story creates memory, and memory becomes tradition. Then, the seasons continue. Summer fades. Autumn arrives. Winter returns. And eventually, another festival approaches. The same cycle begins again. But the people are different. The children have grown. New marriages have taken place. Some people have died. New leaders have risen. New stories have appeared. And the old traditions continue changing. That is important. The Viking Age was not frozen in time. People were constantly adapting. Religious beliefs changed. Political structures changed. Trade routes changed. And eventually, Christianity spread across Scandinavia. The old gods would gradually lose their central position. Churches would appear. New festivals would be introduced. Old traditions would be transformed. And the world of the Viking Age would slowly disappear. But many customs surrounding seasonal celebration, feasting, storytelling, and community would continue in different forms. The names changed. The beliefs changed. The world changed. But people still gathered, still ate, still told stories, still celebrated the turning of the seasons, still remembered their ancestors, and still found reasons to come together. Perhaps that's the most interesting thing about studying Viking festivals. The world they lived in feels incredibly distant. Their ships were different. Their houses were different. Their religion was different. Their technology was different. But the basic human desire behind the celebration feels familiar. People wanted warmth during winter. They wanted food after harvest. They wanted good fortune. They wanted healthy families. They wanted to remember the dead. They wanted to meet friends. They wanted to hear stories. They wanted to laugh. And sometimes, they simply wanted an excuse to eat an unreasonable amount of food with everyone they knew. Some things, apparently, never change. And so, the last guests disappear into the darkness. The hall becomes quiet. The fires slowly die down. The tables are cleared. The songs stop. The stories end. For now, outside, the settlement is quiet again. Tomorrow, people will return to work. The animals will need feeding. The fields will need attention. The boats will need repairs. Life continues. But something has changed. For a little while, everyone had gathered. Everyone had remembered. Everyone had celebrated. And that was enough. The Viking festival is over. But the year is not. The seasons continue turning. The sun moves across the sky. Winter will return. Spring will follow. Summer will come again. And somewhere, in another hall, Another fire will be lit, another feast will begin, another cup will be raised, and someone will begin telling a story. Because the Vikings didn't simply celebrate the passing of the seasons, they built their social world around them. And that world was held together by food, faith, family, friendship, and stories. The fire fades, the hall falls silent, and the Viking year turns once more. The festival is over. The guests have gone home. The fires have burned low. And outside, winter is arriving. The days are becoming shorter. The nights are becoming longer. The fields are empty. The ships are pulled farther onto shore. And slowly, the Viking world begins to retreat indoors. For modern people, winter can be inconvenient. You put on a coat, turn up the heating, buy groceries, and wait for spring. For the Vikings, winter was something you had to prepare for months in advance. There was no central heating, no supermarket, no weather app, no emergency delivery. If you had not prepared properly, winter would remind you. Very quickly, food was the first concern. The harvest had already been gathered. Now the stores became precious. Grain had to be protected. Meat had been preserved. Fish had been dried or otherwise stored. Dairy products had to be managed carefully. Every meal now consumed something that could not easily be replaced. So winter changed the psychology of eating. You weren't simply eating dinner. You were consuming part of your future. A family might look at its food stores and quietly calculate, how much grain do we have? How much meat? How many animals can we afford to slaughter? How long will this last? Nobody wanted to discover the answer too late. The animals themselves also became important. Some livestock could survive outdoors depending on the region and conditions. Others needed shelter. And the animals that survived winter would be extremely valuable when spring arrived. Cows, sheep, goats, horses, pigs. They represented food, labour, transport, and wealth. Losing animals during winter could therefore be a serious economic disaster, so the settlement became quieter. People spent more time indoors. The longhouse became an important centre of daily life. Inside, there was warmth, light from the fire, smoke, people working, people talking, and people trying not to think too much about the weather outside. The longhouse was not exactly a modern living room. It could be crowded, smoky, noisy, and sometimes uncomfortable. But compared with a freezing outdoor landscape, it was home. People repaired tools, worked with textiles, prepared food, maintained equipment, and carried out tasks that could be done indoors. Winter, therefore, wasn't necessarily a period of complete inactivity. Quite the opposite. There was still work, just different work. Clothing needed repairing, weapons needed maintaining, ships needed attention, household objects needed fixing, and stories needed telling. This last part was especially important. The long winter evenings created time for storytelling. Imagine the fire burning in the centre of the hall. Outside, darkness, wind, perhaps snow. Inside, people are gathered close together. Someone begins speaking, a story about an ancestor. Then another story, perhaps a story about a famous warrior. Then one about Odin. Then Thor. Then a strange creature. Then a ridiculous event involving someone everyone knows. The children listen. The adults interrupt. Someone corrects a detail. Someone else says, "That's not how it happened." And suddenly, a completely ordinary evening becomes entertainment. This was the power of oral culture. You didn't need a television. You needed someone who knew a good story. And winter provided plenty of time to listen. The long nights also made memory important. People had time to remember the past. Who had died during the previous year? Who had married? Who had travelled? Who had returned? Which family had gained wealth? Which leader had fallen? Which ship had disappeared? Stories helped connect the present to the past, and winter was a perfect time to tell them. But winter also had a darker side. Isolation. Travel could become difficult. Storms could make the sea dangerous. Snow could cover roads and paths, and people living in remote settlements could become cut off. That meant communities became more dependent on one another. A neighbour might be the difference between safety and disaster. If someone needed help, you couldn't simply call for emergency services. You needed people nearby. This made social relationships even more important. The same people you celebrated with during summer might be the people you depended on during winter. The same family that joined your feast might help you if your animals became sick. The same neighbour who shared food might need your help months later. Reciprocity mattered, community mattered, and trust mattered. Winter tested all three. There was also another problem: darkness. The farther north you lived, the more extreme the seasonal change could become. Summer could bring extraordinarily long days. Winter could bring extraordinarily long nights. Imagine waking up and discovering that there is barely any daylight. You work, you eat, you talk, and outside, the darkness continues. Then the sun disappears again. For people living at northern latitudes, this could shape the rhythm of the entire season. Fire therefore became extremely important, not just for warmth, for light, for cooking, for social life. The fire was the centre. People gathered around it, stories were told around it, food was prepared beside it, and the fire created a small circle of civilization inside the darkness. Outside, cold, wind, snow. Inside, warmth, light, people. The contrast must have been powerful, and eventually, the winter festival season would arrive. The darkest period of the year would bring one of the biggest celebrations: Yule. Feasting, drinking, rituals, stories, and the hope that the sun would eventually return. This was not simply another party. The winter season made the celebration emotionally meaningful. People had survived the year, the harvest had been gathered, the animals had been protected, the stores were full, and now everyone gathered together. The fires became brighter, the food became more abundant, and for a short time, the darkness outside didn't matter, because inside the hall, there was light, there was warmth, there were people, and there was food. That combination could make a winter celebration feel incredibly powerful. But before we return to the feast, there is something important to remember. Winter wasn't always miserable. For some people, it could be a welcome change. The agricultural workload decreased, travel slowed, families spent more time together, craft work could receive more attention, and storytelling became an important form of entertainment. A farmer who had been exhausted by summer work could finally rest a little. A craftsman could spend long evenings working on something carefully. A storyteller could have an audience, and a family could spend more time together. So winter was both difficult and necessary. It created a different rhythm of life. The frantic activity of summer gave way to the slower rhythm of darkness. Then, eventually, the days began getting longer again. The cycle would turn. Spring would return. The fields would open. The animals would go outside. The ships would move. And the Viking year would begin again. But before that happened, there was one celebration that stood at the heart of the winter season. A celebration so important that its traditions would survive long after the Viking gods themselves had faded. Yule. And now, the doors of the longhouse are closing. The winter wind is outside. Inside, the tables are being prepared. The fires are burning. The food is coming out. And the longest celebration of the Viking winter is about to begin. The doors of the longhouse are closed. Outside, winter has taken control of the landscape. The nights are long, the air is cold, the fields are silent, and the sea is often dark and dangerous. But inside, something completely different is happening. The fire is burning brightly, food is being prepared, drink is being served, people are gathering, and the Viking winter has reached its great celebration. Yule. For the Vikings, Yule was far more than simply a pleasant winter holiday. It was connected with the deepest and darkest part of the year. The sun seemed weak, the nights seemed endless, and people were waiting for the world to turn back toward light. That made Yule a powerful seasonal celebration. The exact customs varied across Scandinavia and changed over time. Much of what we know comes from later medieval sources, so we shouldn't imagine that every Viking community celebrated Yule in exactly the same way. But the importance of midwinter feasting is clear, and the word itself survived. The modern English word Yule comes from the old Germanic tradition of this midwinter season. So when people today hear the word, they're hearing an echo from a world that existed more than 1,000 years ago. Inside the Viking hall, the celebration begins with food. And this is where Yule becomes especially important. Winter food had been carefully stored for months. Now, some of it could finally be brought out. Meat, fish, bread, porridge, dairy products, and whatever other supplies the household had managed to preserve. The feast was an expression of abundance. For months, people had been counting their supplies. Now they could eat together. The feast wasn't necessarily extravagant for every household. Wealth varied enormously. A powerful ruler could host an enormous gathering. An ordinary farming household would have had fewer resources. But the basic principle remained. The midwinter season was a time to gather, and gathering meant eating. It also meant drinking. Ale was important in Norse society, and during a major celebration, people could drink together as part of formal toasts. This wasn't simply random drinking. Toasting could have social and religious meaning. Cups could be raised to the gods, to ancestors, to rulers, to peace, to prosperity, and to the future. Imagine the scene. Everyone has a cup. The room becomes quiet. Someone stands. A toast is spoken. Everyone drinks. Then the conversation begins again. Another toast follows later. Then another. The celebration continues. These toasts helped connect people to the traditions of the community. And they also reminded everyone of the relationships that mattered. Family, friends, leaders, ancestors, gods. All of them were part of the mental world of the feast. One figure in particular becomes extremely interesting during the winter season. Odin. Odin was associated with many things. Wisdom, war, death, magic, poetry, and much more. But his connection with the winter world and the supernatural made him an important figure in later interpretations of Yule. There are also traditions connecting Odin with the wild hunt, a supernatural procession moving through the winter sky. The exact relationship between these traditions and Viking Age Yule is complicated. Much of the surviving evidence comes from later periods, so we shouldn't simply say, the Vikings celebrated the wild hunt exactly like this. We don't know that. But the broader idea is fascinating. Winter darkness could be imagined as a time when the boundary between the ordinary world and the supernatural became thinner. The night sky was already mysterious. The landscape was covered in darkness, and people lived in a world where supernatural beings were taken seriously. Stories of gods, spirits, the dead, and other supernatural forces could therefore become especially powerful during the long winter nights. And what better place to tell those stories than around a fire? The storyteller begins. The room becomes quiet. Outside, the wind moves across the landscape. Inside, everyone listens. A story about Odin, then another about Thor. Perhaps a story about giants. Perhaps a story about a hero who travels into a dangerous world. The children listen closely. Some are fascinated. Some are frightened. And some are pretending not to be frightened. Because everyone knows that if you admit you're scared, someone will probably make fun of you. The stories continue. And eventually, the room becomes noisy again. People laugh. Someone tells a joke. Someone interrupts the storyteller. And the feast continues. This mixture of seriousness and humour was probably part of ordinary human celebration. People could discuss the gods, then immediately start laughing about something completely ridiculous. The sacred and the ordinary could exist in the same room. That is one of the most interesting things about Viking festivals. Religion wasn't necessarily separated from everyday life. It could be present during meals, during drinking, during storytelling, during promises, and during seasonal changes. Yule therefore represented both celebration and uncertainty. People were celebrating survival, but they also knew winter wasn't finished. There were still weeks of cold ahead. Food stores would continue shrinking. Animals could become sick. Storms could still come. So the celebration was partly an expression of hope. The darkest season would eventually end. The sun would return. Spring would come. The fields would become productive again. And another year would begin. That hope was built into the seasonal cycle itself. Every winter had an ending, no matter how long the darkness seemed. The days eventually became longer. And that made midwinter psychologically powerful. People could look backward at the year they had survived, and forward toward the year they hoped to have. This was also a time to remember the dead. Ancestors mattered deeply in Norse culture. Family identity stretched backward through generations. So a great winter feast could become an opportunity to remember people who were no longer alive. Perhaps their names were spoken. Perhaps stories were told. Perhaps the family gathered around the same traditions their ancestors had known. The dead were not necessarily forgotten simply because they were gone. They remained part of the family's story. And that story helped define who the living were. You are not simply yourself. You are someone's child, someone's grandchild, someone's descendant. You belong to a line. And the winter feast could remind people of that. Then there was another important element: the relationship between ruler and followers. A powerful Viking leader could host an enormous Yule feast, and this was an opportunity to demonstrate generosity. Remember, generosity was power. A leader who could feed many people demonstrated wealth. A leader who could give valuable gifts demonstrated even more. And people remembered that. Imagine a hall filled with warriors. The leader sits at the center. Food is everywhere. Drink is flowing. Gifts are being distributed. Everyone can see the leader's wealth. Everyone can see who receives honors. Everyone can see who stands close to the ruler. The feast becomes a political display. But it doesn't feel like a political meeting. That's what makes it effective. People are eating, drinking, laughing, celebrating, and at the same time, relationships are being strengthened, promises are being made, loyalty is being reinforced, and reputations are being built. A great Yule feast could therefore be one of the most important events in a leader's calendar, and perhaps one of the most expensive. Feeding a large number of people required enormous quantities of food. The animals had to be raised, the crops had to be harvested, the drink had to be prepared, the hall had to be maintained, and the guests had to be accommodated. A successful feast was therefore evidence of substantial resources. It told everyone, this household is strong. And in a world where status mattered, that message was powerful. But eventually, even the greatest feast had to end. The food disappeared. The drink ran low. The stories became quieter. Some people fell asleep. Others continued talking. And outside, the winter night remained. But something had changed. For a little while, the darkness had been defeated. Not literally, but socially. People had filled the dark season with light, with fire, with food, with stories, with music, with family, and with hope. That may be the deepest meaning of Yule. It wasn't about pretending winter didn't exist. It was about facing winter together. And that is why the celebration mattered. The Vikings couldn't control the weather. They couldn't make the sun return faster. They couldn't guarantee a successful harvest. They couldn't prevent every illness or disaster. But they could gather. They could share what they had. They could remember the past. And they could raise a cup to the future. Eventually, the guests would leave. The fires would become smaller. The doors would close. And the settlement would return to winter life. But the promise of spring remained. The sun would return. The days would lengthen. And the cycle would begin again. The Viking year had turned. And through all of its festivals, one idea kept appearing. The Vikings celebrated because life was uncertain. They celebrated the harvest because food wasn't guaranteed. They celebrated weddings because families needed continuity. They celebrated victories because reputation mattered. They celebrated Yule because winter was difficult. And they gathered because no one wanted to face that uncertainty completely alone. The feast is ending. The hall is quiet. The last embers glow, and outside, the darkness stretches across the snow. But somewhere beyond that darkness, the sun is already beginning its slow return. The year will continue, and so will the stories. Winter is finally losing its grip. The darkness is retreating. The days are becoming longer. Snow begins to disappear. The ground slowly becomes visible again. And somewhere, a bird begins singing. For the Vikings, this meant something important. Spring was coming. The world was waking up. The animals could move outside again. The fields were beginning to change. The sea was becoming easier to travel. And after months of cold, life was beginning again. For a Viking farming community, spring was not simply beautiful. It was essential. The stores of winter food were getting smaller. The animals needed to be taken outside. The fields needed preparation. Seeds needed to be planted. Tools needed to be repaired. And suddenly, everyone had work again. The slow rhythm of winter was ending. The busy rhythm of summer was returning. This transition itself could carry religious meaning. The Vikings lived according to the seasons. They watched the sun. They watched the weather. They watched the animals. They watched the fields. Nature wasn't simply scenery. It was their calendar. And when spring arrived, people knew the next part of the year had begun. There were also practical reasons for celebration. The return of light meant more than pleasant weather. More daylight meant more time to work, more time to travel, more time to fish, more time to repair boats, more time to trade, more time to prepare for the next winter. The cycle started again, and with that cycle, the festivals returned. Spring could bring gatherings connected with fertility, growth, and prosperity. The exact rituals varied between communities and across time, but the underlying concerns were obvious. Would the crops grow? Would the animals remain healthy? Would the summer be productive? Would the harvest be good? These questions mattered enormously. A successful spring could lead to a successful year. A bad spring could create problems that lasted for months. So people watched the sky. They watched the soil. They watched their animals. And they hoped. This was one reason fertility traditions were important in Norse culture. The future depended on growth. Seeds needed to become crops. Animals needed to reproduce. Families needed children. The community needed to continue. Everything was connected, and perhaps no figure represented these hopes better than Freyr. In Norse mythology, Freyr was associated with fertility, prosperity, peace, and abundance. For farming communities, those were not abstract ideas. They were survival. A successful crop meant food. Healthy animals meant wealth. Peace meant fewer disruptions. Prosperity meant security. So religious traditions connected with fertility could feel deeply practical. The people weren't simply asking for something pleasant. They were asking for another year of survival. And that brings us back to one of the most important themes of Viking celebrations: hope. Every festival contained some form of hope. At harvest, hope that the food would last. At weddings, hope for a successful family. At winter feasts, hope for survival. At Yule, hope for the return of light. And now, at the beginning of spring, hope for another successful year. The cycle continued. But spring also meant travel. This was especially important for the Vikings. The sea had been a highway. During favourable seasons, ships could move between settlements. Merchants could travel. Explorers could leave. Warriors could begin expeditions. And families could visit one another. The return of better weather therefore reopened the wider world. The harbour became active again. Ships were inspected. Ropes were repaired. Sails were checked. Wood was replaced. And crews prepared for journeys. For some people, spring meant opportunity. For others, it meant danger. Because the same sea that carried traders could also carry raiders. The Viking world was connected by water. And once the sailing season began, people could go remarkably far. This meant spring festivals could also become moments of planning. Who was travelling? Who was trading? Who was staying home? Which ships were ready? Which families were connected? The gathering could become a place where information was exchanged. Someone had heard about a market. Someone knew of a political conflict. Someone had returned from another region. Someone was planning a journey. The news spread. And then, people made decisions. This was another reason seasonal gatherings were so useful. They weren't isolated events. They were communication hubs. People came together and then carried information outward again. Spring therefore reopened the social network. After months of relative isolation, the world became connected again. And perhaps the most exciting part was simply seeing people. A relative arrives. A friend returns. A traveller brings news. A merchant brings foreign goods. A ship appears on the horizon. The settlement becomes busy. Life becomes noisy again. Children run around. Animals move through the settlement. People repair buildings. Boats are prepared. And the long winter finally feels distant. But spring also brought uncertainty. The year was beginning, but nobody knew how it would end. A farmer could plant a crop and still lose it. A sailor could leave and never return. A trader could make a fortune or lose everything. A marriage could succeed or fail. A family could grow or suffer tragedy. The Vikings lived with uncertainty constantly. Their festivals didn't remove that uncertainty. They gave people a way to face it. Together. That might be the most important lesson of the entire Viking festival calendar. The celebrations weren't attempts to escape reality. They were ways of making reality bearable. When the harvest succeeded, they celebrated. When winter arrived, they gathered. When marriages were made, they feasted. When spring returned, they celebrated again. The world was unpredictable, but the community remained. And that community was built through repeated acts of gathering, eating together, drinking together, working together, praying together, remembering together, and telling stories together. The year has now come full circle. Spring, summer, harvest, winter, Yule, and spring again. The same cycle, but never exactly the same year. New people have been born, others have died. New marriages have been formed, new stories have been created, new journeys have begun, and new memories have been added to the old ones. The Vikings didn't simply live through the seasons. They gave those seasons meaning. They turned the changing landscape into a calendar of stories and celebrations. And perhaps that's why their festivals remain fascinating today. Because beneath the gods, the rituals, the feasts, and the ancient customs, there is something incredibly familiar. People gathered because they wanted to belong. They celebrated because life was uncertain. They ate together because food mattered. They told stories because memory mattered. And they watched the seasons because survival depended on them. The spring sun rises higher. The settlement becomes brighter. The fields begin to turn green. The ships are ready. The year is beginning again. And somewhere, a Viking farmer looks toward the horizon. There is work waiting. There are journeys waiting. There are festivals waiting. And there are stories that haven't been told yet. The cycle begins again. And this time, the Vikings are stepping into a new year. The spring sun is rising. The fields are becoming green again. The ships are returning to the water. The animals are moving outside. And somewhere in a Viking settlement, people are preparing for another year, another harvest, another winter, another wedding, another feast, another story. Because the Viking festival calendar was never really a collection of isolated celebrations. It was a cycle, a rhythm that connected almost every part of life. Spring brought hope, summer brought work, harvest brought relief, winter brought darkness, Yule brought celebration. And then, spring returned. The cycle began again. For the Vikings, this rhythm was unavoidable. They couldn't escape the seasons. Their food depended on them. Their animals depended on them. Their travel depended on them. Their trade depended on them. Even warfare depended on them. The weather decided when ships could travel. The harvest decided how much food was available. Winter decided how long supplies needed to last. And the changing daylight shaped everyday life. So the Vikings didn't simply notice the seasons. They built their lives around them. and their festivals gave those seasons meaning. Think about everything we've seen. The harvest feast wasn't just about eating, it was about survival. The wedding wasn't just about two people, it connected families. The gifts weren't just objects, they created relationships and obligations. The skald wasn't just entertaining people, he preserved reputation and memory. The music wasn't just noise, it helped bring people together. The games weren't just competition, they allowed people to demonstrate skill and strength. The winter gatherings weren't simply an escape from the cold, they created warmth, community, and storytelling. And Yule wasn't merely a party, it marked one of the darkest points of the year, and celebrated the hope that light would return. Everything was connected. Religion, family, food, politics, trade, reputation, entertainment, and survival. That is what makes Viking festivals so interesting. They weren't separate from everyday life. They were everyday life, condensed into a celebration. For a few hours or days, people could step away from ordinary work, but they never truly escaped the realities of their world. The farmer still thought about the harvest. The leader still thought about loyalty. The warrior still thought about reputation. The family still thought about the future. The storyteller still thought about memory. Everyone brought their ordinary concerns into the celebration. And somehow, that made the celebration more meaningful, because they had something real to celebrate. Food, family, survival, friendship, a successful harvest, a marriage, the return of spring, the survival of winter. These weren't abstract ideas. They were things people could see, touch, eat, and share. Imagine the Viking hall one final time. The doors are open. People are arriving. The fire is burning. Food is being prepared. Someone is carrying a large vessel of drink. Children are running around. Adults are talking. A musician is preparing an instrument. A storyteller is waiting for the right moment. Someone has already started laughing. And somewhere near the center of the room, a cup is raised. Everyone becomes quiet. A toast is spoken. The people drink. Then the noise returns. Conversation, laughter, music, stories. The celebration continues. For a modern observer, it might look chaotic. But underneath the noise, there is structure. People are maintaining relationships. They are remembering traditions. They are creating new memories. They are showing generosity. They are demonstrating status. They are passing stories to the next generation. And they are reminding themselves that they belong to this community. That may be the most important thing. Belonging. The Viking world could be dangerous. Disease existed. Storms existed. Famine existed. Conflict existed. Travel was dangerous. Childbirth was dangerous. Winter was dangerous. The sea was dangerous. And nobody knew what the next year would bring. But when people gathered, they didn't face that uncertainty alone. They faced it together. They shared food. They shared stories. They shared traditions. They shared responsibilities. And sometimes, they shared an enormous amount of alcohol. Because apparently, even people living 1,000 years ago understood that some problems feel slightly easier after a feast. But eventually, every celebration ended. The food disappeared. The drink was finished. The musicians stopped. The guests went home. The fires became embers. And ordinary life returned. Yet the festival left something behind. A memory. A new relationship. A promise. A story. A reputation. A tradition. And those things could survive long after the tables were cleared. A child who listened to a story during Yule could remember it decades later. A warrior who received a gift could carry it for years. A family formed through marriage could continue for generations. A story about an ancestor could become part of a family's identity. And a festival repeated every year could become tradition. That is how culture survives. Not because every generation perfectly copies the previous one, but because people keep gathering. They keep telling stories. They keep adapting old customs. And they keep giving meaning to the world around them. The Vikings eventually disappeared as a distinct historical age. Their societies changed. Christianity spread. Political kingdoms became stronger. Old religious practices declined. New institutions appeared. And the Viking Age came to an end. But the human patterns didn't disappear. People still celebrate harvests. People still gather for weddings. People still raise cups in honor of friends. People still tell stories about their ancestors. People still celebrate the return of light after winter. And people still gather together simply because being together feels good. Perhaps that is why the Viking festivals still feel strangely familiar. The details are ancient. The gods are different. The food is different. The buildings are different. The music is different. But the reason people gathered isn't so different from our own. They wanted to celebrate something good while they had the chance. They wanted to remember the people who came before them. They wanted to strengthen relationships. They wanted to laugh. They wanted to eat. They wanted to tell stories. And they wanted to face another uncertain year together. So the Viking festival year comes full circle. Spring arrives. Summer follows. The harvest comes. Winter returns. Yule lights the darkness. And eventually, spring comes again. The wheel turns. Again. And again. And again. The fields become green. The grain grows. The ships sail. The harvest is gathered. The fires are lit. The stories are told. The cups are raised. And somewhere, another Viking celebration begins. The voices rise. The fire crackles. Someone laughs. Someone begins a story. And for a little while, the outside world can wait. Because inside the hall, there is warmth. There is food. There is family. There are friends. There are stories. And there is another year to survive. Another year to celebrate. Another year to remember. And another story, waiting to be told. So as the fire slowly fades, and the hall becomes quiet, imagine the last few people settling down for the night. The food has been eaten. The cups have been emptied. The songs have stopped. Outside, the wind moves across the fields. The stars appear above the settlement. And tomorrow, life begins again. The Vikings will wake. They will work. They will travel. They will trade. They will farm. They will argue. They will laugh. They will love. They will lose people. They will make new memories. And eventually, they will gather again, because the seasons will keep turning and the festivals will return. The Viking year never truly ended. It simply began again, and again, and again.